There is a book that has been banned in American prisons, not because it contains instructions for violence, not because it advocates illegal behaviour, not because it describes anything that could not be found in some form in a dozen history textbooks. It was banned because the people running the prisons decided that the people inside them should not have access to what it contained. And what it contained was knowledge, specifically, the knowledge of how power actually works. Not how civics textbooks say it works, not how your parents described it, not the version with the checks and balances and the meritocracy, and the idea that hard work and good intentions reliably produce good outcomes. How it actually works. In the corridors where decisions are made, in the rooms where alliances are formed and broken, in the specific, observable, historically documented patterns by which some people consistently accumulate influence over others and other people consistently find themselves at the mercy of forces they cannot understand and therefore cannot navigate. The book is The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, published in 1998, initially ignored by the mainstream publishing world, which found it too cynical, too dark, too honest about the mechanisms that polite society prefers to leave unexamined. Then discovered, passed hand to hand, whispered bow, embraced by people who had been operating at the edges of official culture, by hip-hop artists and entrepreneurs and prison inmates and corporate strategists and politicians who would never publicly admit to reading it, by anyone, in short, who had been operating in environments where the official story about how power works had already been exposed as insufficient by direct, painful experience. It has sold over 3 million copies. It has been translated into more than 30 languages. It sits on the shelves of some of the most powerful people in the world alongside the philosophy and the business theory and the history. It sits in the cells of some of the most marginalized people in the world alongside the holy books and the legal papers. Both groups found something in it that they could not find elsewhere. The question this documentary is going to spend the next several hours with is, what did they find? Not abstractly, specifically. What is in this book that produces such extreme reactions and the fascination and the fear, the reverence and the condemnation, the recognition in people who have experienced power's machinery from both its operating end and its receiving end? The answer is not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Robert Greene did not write a comfortable book. He wrote a true one, or at least a book that contains a specific, disturbing, historically grounded, psychologically precise kind of truth. The truth about what human beings actually do with power when they have it. The truth about what human beings actually do to each other in pursuit of it. The truth about the gap, the enormous, morally significant, practically consequential gap between the principles people publicly endorse and the strategies they actually employ. Greene drew his material from history, from the courts of Renaissance Italy and the palaces of ancient China and the boardrooms of 20th century corporations and the campaign strategies of every era's political operators. He was not inventing cynicism, he was documenting it, cataloguing the patterns that recur across every culture and every century wherever there are human beings, and the thing that human beings perpetually seek: more control over their circumstances, more influence over others, more security against the threat of being controlled or influenced or destroyed by someone else's power. The patterns he found are remarkably consistent. Not because human nature is simple, Greene was too sophisticated for that conclusion, but because the psychology that underlies the pursuit and exercise of power is as old. Older than any of the specific historical contexts it operates within. As old as the species, as old as the competition for resources and status and survival that shape the brain, we are all running. And this is the first disturbing thing the book does. Before you have read a single law, before Greene has described a single strategy, the book's historical scope confronts you with an uncomfortable mirror. These are not the strategies of monsters. They are not the exclusive property of the depraved or the exceptional. They are the strategies of humans, across all the centuries and cultures that Greene surveys, by rulers and artists and merchants and generals and lovers and enemies, operating within the logic of a species that has always competed for power and has always used whatever understanding of psychology and human weakness was available to it to gain advantage. You are a member of that species. The people who have used these strategies against you, and some of them have, whether you recognized it or not, were members of that species. The question is not whether the strategies exist. They exist. The question is whether you understand them. Understanding them is the beginning of this documentary. Not approval, not endorsement, understanding. Because the alternative to understanding power is not innocence. It is vulnerability. The person who does not understand how these mechanisms work is not protected from them. They are exposed to them without the ability to recognize what is happening, without the vocabulary, the framework, the historical context that would allow them to see the pattern in what feels, from inside it, like their specific and unique misfortune. Greene's book gave millions of people that vocabulary, and the people who found it most uncomfortable, who condemned it most loudly, who banned it most swiftly were, more often than not, the people who had the most to lose from their subjects and employees and citizens developing it. That is not an accident, and nothing in this documentary is going to pretend that it is. We begin, as Greene begins, at the root of everything, not with a law, with a question that the laws are all, in different ways, attempting to answer. What is power? Not the definition, the experience, the specific felt quality of having it and of lacking it, of being the one who decides and the one who is decided about, of living inside a situation you control and inside one that controls you. What is power? And what does the pursuit of it do to the people who pursue it? Everything that follows is an attempt to answer that question honestly, without the comfort of easy condemnation, without the pretense that the answer is simple, without the pretense that you, reading or listening to this, are entirely outside the dynamics it describes. You are not outside them. None of us are. Let's begin. Before there were 48 laws, there was a man who had spent his entire life on the losing end of power. Robert Greene, born in Los Angeles in 1959, educated at the University of California, brilliant and widely read and genuinely incapable of sustaining the kind of institutional compliance that conventional professional life requires. He worked more than 50 jobs before he turned 40. Writer, editor, translator, researcher, roles that used his mind, none of which used his mind on his own terms, all of which eventually ended in the specific kind of conflict that arises when a genuinely independent intelligence is placed within a structure that requires its subordination. He was not, by his own account, successful at navigating these structures. He was not good at the performance of deference. He was not skilled at managing his superiors' egos or calibrating his behavior to the political requirements of the environments he moved through. He was, in short, the kind of person who keeps getting fired, not for incompetence, but for the more interesting and more costly failure of not understanding how power actually works, and therefore consistently running into it head first. This is important, because it means that the 48 Laws of Power is not the work of a man who had power and was codifying his success. It is the work of a man who had been repeatedly, systematically defeated by power and was trying to understand why. It is an act of reverse engineering, of taking the machinery apart after it has run over you several times, examining each component, naming each gear and lever, and constructing from the wreckage a manual that you wish you had had before you walked into the machine. The book began in 1995 when Greene was working at a book packaging company in Hollywood and encountered a Florentine entrepreneur named Just Elfers. Elfers recognized something in Greene's thinking, a combination of historical range and psychological precision and the specific clarity that comes from having been educated by defeat, and proposed a collaboration. They would write a book about power, not a self-help book, not a management book, a historical and psychological analysis of power's actual mechanisms, drawn from the full sweep of a recorded history, presented without the usual moral qualifications. The writing took 3 years. Greene read everything. Machiavelli and Sun Tzu and Balthazar Gracian, the histories of Caesar and Bismarck and Louis XIV and Catherine the Great, the biographies of artists and scientists and con artists and generals, the case studies of corporate raiders and political operators. He was looking for patterns, the consistent recurring strategies that appear across all of these contexts because they are responses to something consistent in human psychology, rather than to anything specific in any particular historical moment. He found 48 of them, 48 patterns of behavior that, across the entire breadth of his reading, appeared again and again in the repertoire of people who consistently accumulated power and maintained it. Not all of them were used by every powerful person. Not all of them were appropriate in every context. But all of them were real, documented, observable, psychologically explicable responses to the consistent features of human social life. He presented them without editorializing. This was the choice that made the book both so powerful and so controversial. He did not say these are good strategies. He did not say these are bad strategies. He said, these are the strategies that work. Here is the historical evidence. Here is the psychological mechanism. Here is what happens when the law is observed and what happens when it is violated. Draw your own conclusions. The publishing world was uncomfortable. The book was rejected by several houses before finding a home. The discomfort was revealing, not because publishing executives are unusually moral, but because the book threatened something that institutions depend on. It threatened the gap between the official story of how power works, meritocracy, transparency, reward for virtue, and the actual mechanisms. An institution that depends on that gap remaining unexamined has an interest in books that examine it remaining unpublished. The book was published anyway, and it found its audience with the specific speed of something that has been needed and absent. Within years, it was ubiquitous in the worlds of entertainment, sports, business, and politics, the worlds where power is most visibly at stake, and where the official story had always been held most lightly. And it found another audience, the people in prison, the people who had been most thoroughly processed by the machinery of power capaces, who had experienced. Its mechanisms from the position of people it was designed to manage recognized in Greene's 48 laws the precise description of what had been done to them, the vocabulary for what they had lived. That recognition was considered dangerous. Perhaps it was. Perhaps knowledge of the machinery is dangerous to the machinery. Perhaps that is exactly the right reason to understand it. Greene's subsequent life added its own layer to the book's meaning. He suffered a stroke in 2018 at the height of his fame that left him partially paralyzed. He has written about the experience with the same unsentimental precision he brought to the laws, the body's power over the mind, the loss of the control that the entire book was about cultivating, the specific humbling that comes from the encounter with limitations that no strategy can overcome. Even the author of the 48 Laws of Power encounters forces that the laws cannot manage. This is not a refutation of the book. It is its deepest context. Power, even at its most skillfully accumulated and maintained, is always provisional, always operating within a larger frame that it does not control. Understanding that frame, and understanding the 48 laws within it, is the work of everything that follows. Before the laws, the question beneath the laws. Why? Why do human beings compete for power with such consistency, such ferocity, such willingness to pay enormous costs? Why does the desire for control over circumstances, over other people, over resources, over the narrative of one's own life appear in every culture, every historical period, every psychological profile? Why is power not just something that some people want, but something that, in some dimension, virtually everyone wants, and that the absence of produces a specific recognizable form of suffering? The evolutionary answer is the beginning. Not the end. Evolution is never the end of a psychological story, but the foundation that everything else is built on. Human beings evolved in small social groups where relative status was a matter of literal survival. The high-status individual in the ancestral band had better access to food, to mates, to protection, to the decisions that affected everyone's fate. The low-status individual had worse access to all of these things, and was, in the most direct sense, more likely to die and less likely to reproduce. Natural selection, operating across thousands of generations, shaped a brain that is exquisitely sensitive to social status, that monitors it constantly, that experiences status gains as pleasure and status losses as something very close to physical pain, that generates strategies for acquiring and maintaining status with the same automatic urgency that it generates strategies for acquiring food or avoiding predators. This is not a metaphor. The neuroscience is specific. Status threats activate the same neural circuits as physical threats. The loss of status, a public humiliation, a demotion, the recognition that you have been outmaneuvered by someone who now has more influence than you, produces measurable stress responses that are, in their physiological signature, nearly identical to the responses produced by genuine physical danger. Your body does not fully distinguish between being attacked and being embarrassed, between being threatened with violence and being threatened with social irrelevance. The fear of powerlessness is wired into the same ancient circuitry as the fear of death. And here is what this means for Greene's 48 laws. The laws are not arbitrary. They are not the inventions of particularly cynical historical actors who discovered by accident that certain behaviors produce certain results. They are, most of them, responses to the consistent features of a psychology that was shaped by millions of years of social competition. They work, where they work, because they engage with something real in human nature, something that is not going away, something that the laws of any particular society can regulate or redirect but cannot eliminate, because the thing being regulated is older than any society and will outlast all of them. But the evolutionary foundation is only the beginning of the psychological story, because human beings are not only their evolutionary inheritance, they are also their cultures, their experiences, their specific individual histories of having power used on them and having used it themselves. And these layers, the cultural and the experiential, laid over the biological foundation, produce a psychology of power that is enormously complex, enormously varied between individuals, and enormously susceptible to exactly the kinds of strategic manipulation that Greene's laws describe. Consider the specific vulnerability that makes most of the 48 laws possible. It is not stupidity. It is not weakness in any simple sense. It is the gap between the self we present and the self we know ourselves to be, between the image we maintain and the needs and fears that image is constructed to conceal. Every human being carries this gap. The successful professional who is afraid of being exposed as a fraud, the confident person who is terrified of rejection, the generous person whose generosity is partly a defense against the guilt of their actual selfishness, the principled person whose principles are partly a defense against the recognition of their actual desires. These gaps, the space between the presented self and the actual self, are the operating environment of most of Greene's laws. The laws work not by defeating strength, but by finding and engaging weakness. Not by overpowering the target, but by entering through the gap between what they show and what they feel. By offering what the gap is hungry for, validation, certainty, belonging, the sense of being seen and valued, and using the offering as leverage. This is why the laws are morally troubling in a way that goes beyond simple cynicism. Simple cynicism says people are selfish and power is about exploiting that selfishness. Greene's analysis is darker than that. It says people are vulnerable in their most human dimensions. Their need for love and recognition and belonging and significance, these are not weaknesses in the sense of flaws that should be overcome. They are the things that make us human. And the laws of power, applied without conscience, are precisely the tools for exploiting what is most human in the people they are applied to. The Roman emperor who stages a magnificent public spectacle not to celebrate his people, but to make them feel that their lives are grander in his presence than they would be without him. The seducer who offers the appearance of genuine understanding to a lonely person not because they care about loneliness, but because understanding is the price of access. The corporate strategist who cultivates the appearance of invincibility not because they feel invincible, but because others' belief in their invincibility is the source of their actual power. In each case, a genuine human need for beauty, for understanding, for the security of following someone who seems to know what they are doing, is being engaged not to serve it but to use it. And the person whose need is being used rarely knows that is what is happening, because the engagement feels real, because the loneliness that is being engaged by the seducer is genuinely lonely, because the need for strong leadership that the autocrat exploits is genuinely a need. The psychology of power is the psychology of the gap between what people show and what they need. The laws are the map of that gap, and understanding the map is the first step toward recognizing when someone is navigating it at your expense. That recognition is not comfortable. It requires looking at the people who have influenced you most, the ones you admired, the ones you loved, the ones you followed, and asking honestly, were they engaging with what you genuinely were, or with what you most needed someone to see? Sometimes both, often both. Human relationships are rarely purely strategic, but the purely strategic dimension is almost always present somewhere. And seeing it not cynically but clearly is the beginning of the particular kind of freedom that this documentary is about. Every serious reader of the 48 Laws of Power arrives at some point at the same uncomfortable moment. The moment where the law being described, the strategy being explained, the historical example being cited, the psychological mechanism being laid out with Greene's characteristic precision and lack of sentimentality, is not only comprehensible but recognizable. Not just as a strategy that others have used, but as something you yourself have done, perhaps without full awareness, perhaps with full awareness, perhaps in a situation where you felt entirely justified, but done by you. This is the moment that determines how the book will function for each reader. The reader who reaches this moment and retreats, who says, "This is not me, these are the strategies of corrupt and exceptional people, I operate by different principles," has made the book into something useless at best, and dangerous at worst. Useless because the protection the book offers against having these strategies used on you requires the ability to recognize them, which requires the willingness to recognize their presence in yourself. Dangerous because the reader who has convinced themselves that they are above these dynamics is exactly the reader who is most susceptible to them, because their self-image prevents the recognition that would otherwise serve as an alarm. The reader who reaches this moment and accepts it, who says, "Yes, I have done this. I recognize this mechanism in myself, and I am going to understand it rather than deny it," has made the book into something genuinely valuable. Not comfortable. Valuable. Valuable. The moral problem of the 48 Laws of Power is not that it describes immoral behavior. Moral philosophy has described immoral behavior for 3,000 years. The moral problem is that it describes it without condemnation, that it presents strategies that cause real harm to real people, strategies of manipulation, deception, exploitation, and calculated cruelty, with the same analytical neutrality that a biologist might use to describe the behavior of a predator. Here is what it does. Here is why it works. Here is the evidence. The neutrality is deliberate. Greene has explained it in interviews. The choice to present the laws without editorializing was a choice to be taken seriously by the people who most needed to understand them. A book that moralized at every turn would be, he argued, less useful than a book that trusted its readers to draw their own moral conclusions. The preacher's tone would signal to the reader that they were being managed, that the information was being delivered in a form designed to produce a particular emotional and moral response rather than a genuine encounter with the material. The neutrality is also, in one specific sense, honest, because the moral evaluation of many of the 48 laws is not as simple as it initially appears. Some of the laws are morally straightforward in their condemnation. Law 17, for instance, which advises keeping others in suspended terror, is a description of psychological abuse, and calling it anything else is dishonest. But others occupy genuinely complex moral territory. Law 1, which advises never outshining the master, describes a social reality that is simultaneously a prescription for self-preservation and a description of the dynamics that keep talented people in subordinate positions. Is it a law of oppression or a law of survival? It is both, and the moral evaluation depends entirely on whose position you are evaluating it from. This moral complexity is real and should not be resolved prematurely. The 48 laws describe strategies that have been used by everyone from Julius Caesar to Martin Luther King, by people whose exercise of power produced horror, and by people whose exercise of power produced liberation. The strategies themselves are, in the most fundamental sense, neutral. They are tools, and the moral evaluation of a tool cannot be separated from the evaluation of the hand that wields it, the purpose it is wielded for, and the consequences it produces. But, and this is crucial, the neutrality of the tool does not mean the neutrality of the knowledge. Knowing these laws and using them without conscience produces specific harms to specific people. And the person who uses them needs to understand this clearly, not because Greene requires it, he doesn't, but because the person who uses power without understanding its costs is, over time, paying those costs in ways they cannot see. The people who have most thoroughly embodied the 48 laws, the ones history remembers as their most complete expression, are not, in the main, happy people. They are powerful people, effective people, people whose names are remembered, but the record of their inner lives, where it survives, is not the record of lives that their powers satisfied. It is the records of lives that their powers consumed, of relationships destroyed by the inability to trust, of intimacy made impossible by the habit of strategic thinking, of the specific loneliness of a person who has learned to see every relationship as a power dynamic and every person as a potential ally or threat. This is the moral cost that the laws do not mention, not because Greene missed it, because it is not the subject of the book. The book is about how power works. The cost of power is a different subject, one that this documentary will not avoid because avoiding it would be its own kind of dishonesty. The laws work. They produce the outcomes they describe, and they cost something. The something varies, but it is always real. Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through all 48. To understand the 48 laws of power, you have to understand the world it describes, not the 21st century, not any specific historical period, the permanent world, The world that has existed wherever human beings have organized themselves into groups with differential access to resources and influence, which is to say, every human world there has ever been. Greene draws his primary examples from a specific set of historical contexts, the Italian Renaissance courts, where the rules of political survival were articulated with extraordinary sophistication by thinkers like Machiavelli, precisely because the courts were extraordinarily dangerous. The Chinese imperial court, which produced the art of war and the 36 stratagems and centuries of political philosophy about the maintenance and exercise of power, in environments where the wrong move meant death. The court of Louis XIV at Versailles, which was, by any measure, one of the most elaborate and sustained experiments in the social management of power ever constructed, a court designed to concentrate authority in a single person by making everyone else compete for proximity to that person and therefore dependent on his favour. What these contexts share is not their historical specificity, it is their structural features. They are all environments where power is concentrated, where the rules of competition are unwritten, where survival depends on the accurate reading of social dynamics, where the official ideology and the actual operating principles are substantially different, and where the consequences of miscalculation are severe. Sound familiar? It should. These structural features are not historical curiosities. They are the permanent features of every organization above a certain size, every family with complicated internal politics, every social environment where resources are scarce and competition for them is real. The specific costumes change, the mechanism stays the same. The courtier navigating the politics of Versailles and the junior executive navigating the politics of a large corporation are operating in structurally identical environments. The Renaissance advisor trying to stay useful to a prince without being used up by him, and the political operative trying to maintain influence with an elected official they helped put in office are facing structurally identical challenges. The historical specificity of Greene's examples is pedagogical. It provides distance, which makes the mechanisms easier to see than they are in the environments we ourselves inhabit. But the mechanisms are the same. This is the first thing to understand about why the book has the reach it has. It is not describing an unusual world. It is describing the world that most people who have operated in large, competitive, hierarchical, human institutions already know from direct experience, but that nobody was giving them the vocabulary to name. The second thing to understand is who the laws were written for. Not for the already powerful. The already powerful do not, in the main, need a book. They have accumulated their power through the direct experiential learning of what works, through decades of navigating the exact dynamics the book describes. The laws are written for people in the process of learning, people in the early and middle stages of their engagement with power's machinery, who are encountering its mechanisms without the benefit of the long experience that eventually teaches most things to most people. They are written especially, and this is the demographic that the book's actual readership most consistently reflects, for people who were not born into environments where power's mechanics were explicitly taught. The aristocrat's child is, in some sense, trained from birth in the management of power relationships. The child of the elite family learns, through osmosis and explicit instruction, the specific behaviors that maintain position and the specific behaviors that threaten it. They learn who to defer to and how. They learn how to manage up and how to manage down. They learn the specific arts of impression management and coalition building that the institutions they will inhabit are organized around. The child of the non-elite family is not taught these things. They enter the same institutions with the same intelligence and the same capacity for hard work and often more motivation, and they encounter the machinery of power without the tools to navigate it. They mistake competence for protection. They mistake honesty for virtue that will be rewarded. They mistake the official rules for the actual rules. And they learn, through a series of painful, confusing, and often career-damaging encounters, that the environment is not operating by the principles they were taught. Greene's book is, in significant part, a corrective to that asymmetry, a levelling of the informational playing field, a transmission of the knowledge that aristocrats and elites absorb through their environment, the practical and sentimental understanding of how power actually works, to the people who are not born into environments where it was transmitted. That this levelling is uncomfortable for people who benefit from the asymmetry is not a reason to avoid it. It is a reason to pursue it. Now, the laws! The first law is the most immediately recognizable. You have probably violated it. If you are intelligent and capable, and have spent any time in a hierarchical institution, a company, a school, a political organization, a family, you have almost certainly at some point made the mistake of being too impressive in the presence of someone who had more power than you and whose ego was not large enough to welcome the comparison. Never outshine the master. Make those above you feel comfortably superior. In your desire to please and impress them, do not go too far in displaying your talents, or you might accomplish the opposite. Inspire fear and an insecurity. Make your masters appear more brilliant than they are, and you will attain the heights of power. The historical example Greene uses is Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances for Louis XIV of France. Fouquet was brilliant, wealthy, cultured, and oblivious to the danger of his own brilliance. In 1661, he threw a party at his chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte that was, by every account, one of the most magnificent entertainments ever staged in France. The food was extraordinary. The entertainment was extraordinary. The gardens were extraordinary. 6,000 guests. Molière wrote a play for the occasion. The fireworks lit the sky over the Loire Valley for miles. The king was there, and the king was, by every account, furious. Not because Fouquet had done anything wrong, because Fouquet had done everything right. The party was so perfect, so expensive, so clearly beyond anything the king himself could have staged at that moment, that it communicated, without a word being spoken, something that the king could not forgive. That his minister was more capable than he was, that there was someone in France who could produce magnificence on a scale that exceeded the monarch's own. Within 3 weeks, Fouquet was arrested. He was tried on charges of corruption that were genuine but selectively prosecuted from a pool of corruption that was essentially universal among Louis's ministers. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in jail 19 years later. And Louis, having destroyed him, used Fouquet's confiscated art collection and hired his architect and his landscape designer to build Versailles, the explicit goal of which was to create a magnificence that would never again allow any subject to outshine the king. The psychological mechanism is elementary once named. People in positions of power arrive there through a combination of ability, circumstance, and the cultivation of a self-image that their position confirms and depends on. That self-image, I am here because I'm capable enough to be here, is fragile in the specific way that all self-images are fragile. It requires constant environmental confirmation, and the subordinate who is visibly more capable than the superior threatens that confirmation at its root. The threat is not logical. The superior's position is not actually endangered by a capable subordinate in most cases. Indeed, capable subordinates are generally the source of a superior's actual results, and any rational analysis would conclude that having them is desirable. But the threat is psychological, and psychological threats do not respond to rational analysis. They respond to the anxiety that a hierarchy dependent on the self-image of the person at the top generates whenever that self-image is challenged. Now, the moral dimension. And this is where the law becomes genuinely troubling rather than merely pragmatically inconvenient. The advice to never outshine the master is, functionally, advice to perform inferiority you do not feel, to suppress the expression of your actual capabilities in order to protect the ego of someone who has power over you. It is advice to maintain the gap, the artificial gap between the competent subordinate and the less competent superior, that keeps the superior comfortable and the subordinate in place. Followed universally, this law would produce an organizational world in which capability is systematically suppressed in the interest of hierarchy, in which the most capable people in any institution consistently underperform in order to protect the egos of the people above them, in which organizations are led not by their most capable members, but by their most comfortable ones, the people whose egos are sufficiently unchallenged that they can tolerate capable subordinates without feeling threatened. This is not a hypothetical consequence. It is a description of how most large institutions actually function for most of their history. The stifling of talent by insecure hierarchy is not the exception. It is one of the most consistent patterns in organizational life. And Law 1 followed. Strategically by the capable person who wants to survive in such an organization, not only accommodates this pattern but reinforces it. It says to the talented subordinate, suppress yourself, perform your inferiority, make the less capable person above you feel superior, because the alternative is to be destroyed as Fouquet was destroyed. The person who follows this law is not wrong in the sense of being strategically mistaken. They are probably right. Given an insecure superior and a real power differential and real consequences for threatening the superior's self-image, strategic self-suppression is probably the correct survival strategy in the short term. But the person who follows this law is also colluding in something. They are choosing, for their own protection, to maintain a fiction, the fiction that the superior is superior, that has cost not only for themselves, but for everyone who depends on the organization functioning with its actual best judgment, rather than its hierarchy's most comfortable judgment. This is the moral texture of the 48 laws, not simple evil, complex trade-offs between individual survival and collective cost, between the short-term logic of a specific power dynamic and the long-term cost of a world organized by that logic. Law 1 is real, it works, and it describes a world that we should not be comfortable with even as we navigate it. The second law is the one that makes people put the book down. Never put too much trust in friends, learn how to use enemies. Be wary of friends, they will betray you more quickly, for they are easily aroused to envy with little resentment. They expect more from you. Hire a former enemy and he will be more loyal than a friend because he has more to prove. In fact, you have more to fear from friends than from enemies. The immediate reaction is rejection. This is cynicism so thoroughgoing as to be inhuman. The advice to treat friendship as a resource to be managed rather than a bond to be honoured. To view the people closest to you as your greatest vulnerabilities rather than your greatest strengths. But Greene is making a specific, historically grounded, psychologically precise observation. And the observation is not that friends are bad, it is that the category of friend in the context of power relationships is systematically misleading about the actual dynamics of the relationship. Here is the mechanism. A friend, by definition, has access to you. They know your weaknesses, your fears, your strengths, the specific texture of your vulnerabilities. They are in your life at the level where the gap between your presented self and your actual self is smallest. They have proximity. Physical proximity, emotional proximity, the proximity of shared history that no enemy has. And proximity, in the context of power, is always double-edged. It is both the source of the friend's value and the source of their danger. The deeper mechanism is envy. And envy, as Munger noted from his entirely different perspective, is one of the most powerful and most underestimated forces in human social life. Between strangers or enemies, the success differential is processed as simple difference. They are in a different category. Their success does not reflect on mine. Between friends, the same success differential is processed as comparison. We are in the same category. We started from the same place. Their success is my shortfall. This comparison, the specific corrosive comparison that friendship makes possible, is the source of a betrayal dynamic that history documents with depressing consistency. Caesar and Brutus, Thomas Becket and Henry II, Thomas More and Henry VIII. The pattern repeats. The person most trusted, most intimate, most believed in becomes, when the power differential grows too large, when the envy accumulates beyond the tolerance of the friendship's conventional demands, the person most likely to act against. Not because they are evil people, because they are human people in the specific situation that friendship creates when power is unequally distributed. The situation of intimate proximity to someone whose success exceeds their own, sustained over time, without the psychological distance that would allow the success to be processed as simply different rather than personally diminishing. Now the application to enemies, which is the part of the law that is genuinely counterintuitive and genuinely useful. A rehabilitated enemy, a person who was previously in opposition and has been brought over to your side, has several properties that the friend lacks. They come without the entitlement that long friendship generates. They come with something to prove. They know, better than most, the cost of being on the wrong side of the power differential they are now on the right side of. And they come with the specific motivation of someone who has been given a gift, the gift of inclusion, of trust, of being valued by someone they previously opposed, and knows that the gift is conditional on their performance. The historical example is Cardinal Richelieu, who consistently preferred rehabilitated enemies to trusted friends in staffing his government. His reasoning was precisely this: the friend expects, the rehabilitated enemy proves. The friend's loyalty is assumed and therefore untested. The rehabilitated enemy's loyalty is demonstrated through repeated performance against the background of the alternative they know too well. The moral dimension of Law 2 is the most complex of any law in the book. Because the advice to distrust friends, to maintain strategic distance from the people who are most intimate with you, to never fully relax the political consciousness even in friendship, describes a way of being in relationship that has enormous costs for the person who lives by it. The person who follows this law consistently does not have friends in any conventional sense. They have allies, subordinates, clients, competitors, and adversaries. The category of person who is simply unconditionally present for you without strategic calculation, that category has been eliminated by the law that was supposed to protect you from its dangers. This is not a trivial cost. It is, arguably, the central cost of the pursuit of power. The progressive replacement of genuine relationship with strategic relationship until the person at the top of the power structure is surrounded by people who are there for reasons other than genuine affection and genuinely cannot tell the difference. Trust the law and you will be less vulnerable to the specific betrayal of the trusted friend. You will also be more alone than almost anyone you know. And the specific loneliness of the powerful person, surrounded by dependents and flatterers and strategic allies, starved of anyone who will simply tell them the truth because they love them, is one of the most consistent features of the historical record that Greene draws from. The law works. The cost of the law is a life without the thing that the law is protecting you from losing. Think about that. The third law describes something that almost everyone does, that almost no one admits, and that the gap between the doing and the admitting tells you almost everything you need to know about the social function of honesty. Conceal your intentions, keep people off balance and in the dark by never revealing the purpose behind your actions. If they have no clue what you're after, they cannot prepare a defense. Guide them far enough down the wrong path, envelop them in enough smoke, and by the time they realize your intentions, it will be too late. The shock of this law, for most people, is the recognition that it is not describing an unusual behavior. It is describing one of the most common. The person who announces their plans only after they have secured the outcome. The negotiator who reveals their actual position only after they have understood yours. The political candidate who speaks in generalities during the campaign and governs according to specific interests once in office. The person who has decided to leave a relationship but maintains all the appearances of the relationship until they are ready for the departure to be final. All of these are applications of the third law. Some of them we condemn, some of them we accept as normal strategy. The line between the two is less clear than we usually pretend. Greene's historical example is Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian statesman who unified Germany through a strategy of such elaborate concealment of intentions that most of his contemporaries, including the men who were working most closely with him, had no idea what he was actually building until it was essentially complete. He would pursue a policy for months, allowing others to believe it was the policy he believed in, while working toward a destination he never revealed. By the time the destination was visible, the structure was in place and the opposition was too late to be effective. The psychological mechanism is the most basic in Greene's framework. People cannot resist what they cannot see coming. Defense requires foreknowledge. If you know what someone wants, you can either give it to them at a price of your choosing or deny it to them in a way that protects your own position. If you do not know what they want, if their behavior is consistent with multiple possible intentions, you cannot effectively calibrate your response to any of them. You're always slightly wrong-footed, always responding to what they appeared to want rather than what they actually wanted, always one step behind a game whose board you cannot see. The moral dimension is straightforwardly about deception and what deception does to trust, and the answer at the social level is clear. Concealment of intentions, practiced widely, practiced without restraint, produces a social environment in which no one can take anyone's stated reasons at face value, in which every action must be evaluated not for what it appears to be, but for what it might actually be serving, in which the cognitive load of navigating social reality is massively increased by the permanent uncertainty about other people's actual motivations. This is not a hypothetical consequence. It is a description of specific social environments, the court, the political arena, certain corporate cultures, where the concealment of intentions is so universal that everyone inside the environment has developed elaborate techniques for reading behind the stated rationale to the actual intention. Where the first question in response to anyone's stated position is not, do I agree with this? But what does this person actually want, and what does acknowledging this position cost me? Living in such an environment is exhausting. Producing such an environment through the consistent application of Law 3 is a contribution to a specific kind of social deterioration. And yet, The person who does not conceal their intentions in an environment where everyone else does is not virtuous. They are simply legible, and legibility in a world of strategic actors is a vulnerability. The honest person in a dishonest environment is not protected by their honesty. They are exposed by it. Their openness is the gap through which every strategic operator will enter. This is the genuine trap that the third law describes. Not, should I conceal my intentions or should I not? But, what is the right behavior when the environment is one of general concealment? The choice is not between strategic concealment and virtuous transparency. It is between strategic concealment and unilateral transparency, in a world where the other party is not reciprocating, which is not virtue but vulnerability. The law works. The world it creates is not one you want to live in, and you may already be living in it. Power, in its most refined form, is not loud. Always say less than necessary. When you are trying to impress people with words, the more you say, the more common you appear, and the less in control. Even if you are saying something banal, it will seem original if you make it vague, open-ended, and sphinx-like. Powerful people impress and intimidate by saying less. The more you say, the more likely you are to say something foolish. The immediate recognition, for most people, is of the specific anxiety that this law is designed to manage. The anxiety of silence. The compulsion in social and professional situations that feel charged with judgment to fill the available space with words, to demonstrate competence through verbal output, to prove that you are engaged, thinking, present, and worthy of the position you occupy by showing all of your work. This compulsion is almost universally counterproductive, not because silence is always superior to speech, of course it isn't, but because the compulsion to speak is driven by anxiety rather than by judgment. And anxiety-driven speech has several consistent properties that the law is pointing at. It reveals more than is strategically useful. It forecloses options by committing to positions before the positions have been adequately evaluated. It creates vulnerabilities by providing opponents with material they would not otherwise have. And it communicates through its very compulsiveness, a kind of insecurity that undermines the impression it was trying to create. Louis XIV was famous for it. The king said almost nothing. Visitors to Versailles would prepare for weeks for an audience with the monarch, constructing elaborate presentations of their requests and their qualifications and their arguments. The king would listen, and then, sometimes, say a single sentence, or sometimes nothing at all. And the visitor would leave, uncertain whether they had succeeded or failed, forced to interpret the silence, unable to calibrate their response because there was nothing definite to respond to. The psychological mechanism is the mechanism of projection. The person who says less invites the other person to fill the silence with their own hopes and fears. The ambiguous response is interpreted by the listener through the lens of their own psychology. They hear in it what they most hope to hear or most fear to hear, because the actual content is insufficient to anchor any specific interpretation. And the interpretation, being self-generated, is believed with the conviction that self-generated beliefs always carry. The salesperson who says less allows the customer to sell themselves. The negotiator who speaks less forces the other party to over-reveal. The leader whose communications are sparse and infrequent produces in their followers a constant, anxious attention to every word, because the scarcity of communication makes each communication seem maximally significant. The moral dimension here is subtler than in some other laws. The advice to say less is not inherently deceptive. There is nothing dishonest about economy of expression. But the strategic use of silence, the deliberate withholding of communication as a power tool, the cultivation of ambiguity as a means of maintaining advantage over people who are genuinely uncertain about your position, enters moral complexity when it is used in relationships where the other party has a reasonable expectation of clear communication. The leader who maintains strategic ambiguity about their intentions, in order to keep their followers in a state of productive uncertainty, is doing something that feels different from what the word leadership is supposed to mean. The partner who says less than necessary in order to maintain the interpretive uncertainty that keeps the other person off balance is doing something that the word relationship is supposed to preclude. The professional who cultivates an air of inscrutability not because they have nothing to say, but because saying it would reduce their power, is using a form of communication as a dominance display. Where the law becomes genuinely wise rather than merely strategic is in the recognition that most people say too much from anxiety, not from genuine communicative need. The discipline of saying less. not as a strategic calculation, but as a practice of thoughtfulness, of speaking only when you have something worth saying, of allowing silence to do its work without rushing to fill it, produces clearer communication, better decisions, and relationships of greater quality than the anxious verbal overproduction that the law is correcting. The law, applied without conscience, produces a world of strategic inscrutability. Applied with wisdom, it produces the simple, underrated quality of knowing when to speak and when not to. Reputation is not what you think about yourself, it is what others think about you, and others' thoughts about you are the most powerful force in social life, more powerful in most practical situations than your actual qualities, your actual achievements, your actual character. This is the uncomfortable reality that Law 5 forces into the open. So much depends on reputation. Guard it with your life. Reputation is the cornerstone of power. Through reputation alone, you can intimidate and win. Once you slip, however, you are vulnerable and will be attacked on all sides. Make your reputation unassailable. Greene's historical example is the financier Thomas Edison's methodical destruction of Nikola Tesla's reputation during the War of Currents, the late 19th century battle between Edison's direct current electrical system and Tesla's alternating current system, which was technically superior. Edison, recognizing that he was losing the technical argument, shifted the battle to the reputational level. He staged public demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted using Tesla's alternating current, specifically to associate AC power with death and danger in the public mind. He lobbied for AC current to be used in the electric chair for executions, again, specifically to link Tesla's technology with killing. The strategy worked, for a time. Tesla's reputation suffered. The public fear of a C current was real and powerful, based on exactly the association that Edison had manufactured. The underlying psychology is the heuristic that governs most human judgment in conditions of limited information. We cannot directly verify most of the things we need to make decisions about. We cannot personally test every technology, evaluate every professional, assess every organization. We rely, necessarily and inevitably, on reputation on the accumulated, socially circulated assessments of others. This reliance is not irrational. In the absence of direct information, reputation is often the best available proxy. The professional with a strong reputation has, on average, done things that earned the reputation. But the reliance on reputation creates a specific vulnerability to reputation manipulation. If you cannot verify directly, you can be misled by manufactured reputational signals. And the history of reputation warfare, the deliberate construction and destruction of reputations for strategic advantage, is as old as human social competition. The moral dimensions of this law branch in several directions. The first is the straightforward ethics of reputation destruction, the Edison strategy, the deliberate manufacturing of false associations, the use of the legitimate human need to rely on reputation as a vector for disinformation. This is clearly, unambiguously wrong. It is fraud at the level of social epistemology. The second is the ethics of reputation construction, the cultivation of an image that may or may not accurately represent the underlying reality. This is where the moral analysis becomes genuinely complex. All public figures cultivate their reputations. All professionals manage their images. The line between legitimate impression management and dishonest misrepresentation is real but not always clear. The lawyer who dresses carefully for court is managing their reputation. The surgeon who is brusque with patients, not because they are arrogant, but because they have learned that confident brevity inspires confidence that improves outcomes, is managing their reputation. These are not straightforwardly dishonest. The third dimension is the most philosophically interesting. The law advises guarding your reputation with your life, treating it as the central strategic asset. This advice is correct in the narrow strategic sense. Reputation loss is difficult to recover from, the effects persist long after the cause, and the social machinery that disseminates negative reputation is faster and more thorough than the machinery that revises it. But the person who guards their reputation with their life is a person who has placed their public image ahead of everything else, including the honest acknowledgement of failure, the willingness to take positions that the crowd does not hold, and the simple human openness to being seen as the imperfect, inconsistent, sometimes wrong person that everyone actually is. The life lived in defense of reputation is a life lived in performance, and performance, sustained indefinitely, produces a specific kind of exhaustion and a specific kind of inauthenticity that the laws do not address and that the pursuit of power consistently costs. Before you can exercise power over people, they have to know you exist. This sounds obvious. It is less obvious than it sounds, because the kind of attention that power requires is not the neutral, informational kind, the kind that results from people simply knowing who you are and what you do. It is the charged, emotional, slightly destabilizing kind, the kind that makes people feel something when they think about you, the kind that makes them talk, court attention at all cost. Everything is judged by its appearance. What is unseen counts for nothing. Never let yourself get lost in the crowd then, or buried in oblivion. Stand out. Be conspicuous, at whatever cost. Make yourself a magnet of attention by appearing larger, more colourful, more mysterious than the bland and timid masses. Greene's primary example is P.T. Barnum, the impresario of the 19th century entertainment world, the man who built the most famous circus in American history on the single principle that there is no such thing as bad publicity. Barnum understood something about attention that most of his contemporaries did not, that the emotional valence of attention is less important than its intensity. The person who makes you curious is more powerful than the person who makes you comfortable. The thing that makes you say what is more memorable than the thing that makes you say yes, that makes sense. The psychology is the psychology of the brain's attention allocation system. Human attention is a scarce resource in permanent competition for allocation. The brain is constantly deciding what to notice and what to ignore, what to allocate the precious currency of conscious attention to, and what to filter into the background. The things that win the competition for attention share a set of properties: novelty, intensity, emotional charge, threat, mystery, beauty. The things that lose the competition share the opposite properties: familiarity, moderation, predictability, safety. The person who courts attention, who makes themselves novel, intense, emotionally charged, mysterious, or beautiful, wins the competition for the cognitive real estate that makes influence possible. And the person who cannot win that competition, who is safe and predictable and moderate and familiar, is not available to influence anyone because they are not present to anyone's attention in a way that could support influence. The moral dimension of this law is about authenticity and its relationship to performance. The person who courts attention at all cost has made the cultivation of their image into the central activity of their life. Everything becomes evaluated for its attention value. Every behaviour is considered through the lens of how it will be perceived, how it will be talked about, what impression it will create. The authentic impulse is consistently subordinated to the strategic one. In the social media era, this law has become the operating principle of an entire cultural industry, the attention economy, and its costs are visible at a scale that Barnum could not have imagined. The specific damage done to individual psychology and collective epistemology by a system that rewards attention-maximizing behavior regardless of its accuracy, honesty, or value is now measurable and large. The incentive to be outrageous, provocative, emotionally destabilizing, because these qualities win the attention competition, consistently overwhelms the incentive to be accurate, thoughtful, or constructive, because those qualities lose it. This is Law 6, applied at civilizational scale. The consequences are not subtle. There is a practice so common in organizational life that it has acquired a name, credit-taking, and that name is used almost exclusively in condemnation. The manager who takes credit for the team's work, the senior executive who presents the analyst's research as their own synthesis, the politician who claims responsibility for outcomes that their predecessors or subordinates produced. We condemn these practices, we condemn them consistently. And the condemnation has essentially no effect on their prevalence, because the condemnation operates at the level of moral principle, while the practice operates at the level of power reality. Get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit. Use the wisdom, knowledge, and legwork of other people to further your own cause. Not only will such assistance save you valuable time and energy, it will give you a godlike aura of efficiency and speed. In the end, your helpers will be forgotten, and you will be remembered. The historical example is the scientist Isaac Newton, who famously said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," and then spent decades in bitter priority disputes with contemporaries like Leibniz and Hooke over who had actually made the discoveries that defined his reputation. Newton's actual practice was the opposite of the collaborative humility his famous statement implied. He was ferocious in claiming priority and in defending his reputation against any suggestion that his achievements were shared or preceded. The psychological mechanism is the simple, powerful reality that reputation is assigned to individuals, not to process. History remembers names. Organizations have hierarchies that determine whose name goes on outcomes. The person who understands how the credit allocation mechanism works and positions themselves at the location where credit is assigned, rather than at the location where work is done, accumulates the reputational capital that the worker accumulates none of regardless of the distribution of actual contribution. The moral dimension is straightforward in its immediate expression. Credit theft is a form of fraud, a misrepresentation of contribution, and complex in its systemic implications. In organizations where credit consistently flows upward regardless of contribution, the people who do the most valuable work are consistently the least recognized and the least powerful. This misalignment between contribution and recognition is not only unfair, it is inefficient. It produces organizations that systematically misallocate the resources, attention, compensation, status that are supposed to signal and reinforce valuable contribution. And yet the person who does valuable work and fails to manage its credit allocation, who naively assumes that good work will be recognized on its merits, is not virtuous. They are simply invisible. In any organization with a functional credit-taking culture, the modest contributor who lets their work speak for itself will find that their work has been spoken for by someone else. The law works. The world it creates rewards political skill over productive contribution. Both of those statements are true simultaneously. Control of the terrain is control of the encounter. This is a principle as old as military strategy and as new as negotiation theory, and its applications extend far beyond either context. Make other people come to you, use bait if necessary. When you force the other person to act, you are the one in control. It is always better to make your opponent come to you, abandoning his own plans in the process. Lure him with fabulous gains, then attack. You hold the cards. The psychological mechanism is about the relationship between initiative and vulnerability. The person who travels to you has already committed. They have invested time and energy in the journey. They are on your territory, surrounded by your signals and your people. They have revealed, through the act of coming, that they wanted the meeting more than you did, or at least that they wanted it enough to absorb the cost of coming while you absorbed nothing. The person who stays and makes others come to them has preserved all of their options. They have revealed nothing about the intensity of their desire. They have placed themselves in the psychologically advantageous position of the sought rather than the seeker, and they have forced the other party to begin the interaction, already having given something, the journey, the initiative, the acknowledgement that the destination was worth reaching. Napoleon Bonaparte, Greene tells us, used this principle to devastating effect in his Italian campaigns. Rather than chasing the Austrian forces across the terrain they chose, he consistently manoeuvred to create situations where the Austrians felt compelled to attack him on ground he had selected. The attack was always their initiative, and therefore always slightly wrong, always slightly calibrated to a situation that was no longer the situation by the time the attack was underway. The moral dimension is about manipulation and the ethics of manufactured urgency. The bait described in the law's title is specifically designed to create in the other party a desire strong enough to overcome their natural caution and draw them toward you. The bait need not be dishonest, it can be a genuine offer, but its strategic function is to override the other party's judgment about whether coming to you is in their interest by creating an emotional response strong enough to suppress that judgment. This is manipulation in its most basic form, the use of desire to override judgment. It is ubiquitous. It is the mechanism of advertising, of seduction, of political demagoguery, of the sales technique, of the negotiation ploy. It is the technology of making other people's desires work for your purposes rather than their own. This law contains one of the most practically useful observations in the entire book, and it is grounded in a psychological reality so fundamental that it should be part of every child's education and instead is learned, if at all, through decades of painful experience. Win through your actions, never through argument. Any momentary triumph you think you have gained through argument is really a Pyrrhic victory. The resentment and ill will you stir up is stronger and lasts longer than any momentary change of opinion. It is much more powerful to get others to agree with you through your actions without saying a word. The insight is about the relationship between argument and ego. When you argue with someone, when you present a case for why they are wrong and you are right, you are not primarily engaging with their reasoning. You are engaging with their identity. Their current position is not just a belief they hold. It is a belief that is attached to their sense of self, their status, their history, their tribe. Changing the belief requires them to admit that the previous belief was wrong, and admitting error, in the context of a direct argument with another person, is not merely an intellectual concession. It is a social and psychological one. It is the acknowledgement, in the presence of an opponent who is watching them lose, that the opponent was right and they were wrong. Very few people will make this concession regardless of the quality of the argument. Not because they are stupid or uniquely stubborn, because the psychological cost of public concession in the context of adversarial argument is higher than almost any intellectual benefit the concession would produce. The person who wins the argument has demonstrated their superior reasoning, which is pleasant for them. They have also damaged the relationship, increased the resistance to the position they were arguing for, and ensured that the person who lost the argument will spend considerable emotional energy finding reasons why they were actually right. The alternative, demonstrating the correctness of your position through action, through outcomes, through evidence that is not presented adversarially, but that accumulates in the environment until the other person's position is simply unsupported by anything they can see, avoids all of these costs. The person who comes to a new position because the world demonstrated it to them has not been defeated. They have been persuaded by reality, which is something they can accommodate without ego damage, because reality winning the argument is not the same as you winning the argument. The moral dimension of this law is one of the least troubling in the entire book. The advice to demonstrate rather than argue is not manipulative in any deep sense. It is simply wise. Wise about human psychology, wise about the relationship between ego and belief, wise about the conditions under which genuine persuasion is possible, as opposed to the conditions that merely create the appearance of persuasion while generating invisible resistance. The one caveat is that demonstrating rather than arguing requires patience, and patience requires the willingness to allow situations to remain apparently unresolved for longer than the desire to be right in the immediate moment can comfortably tolerate. The person who follows Law 9 consistently must be willing to act without immediate acknowledgement, to allow their correctness to be demonstrated over time rather than conceded in the present, and to resist the gratification of winning the argument in favour of the less immediately satisfying but more durable satisfaction of winning the outcome. This is the law that disturbs sensitive readers most. Infection. Avoid the unhappy and unlucky. You can die from someone else's misery. Emotional states are as infectious as diseases. The unfortunate sometimes draw misfortune on themselves. They will also draw it on you. Associate with the happy and fortunate instead. The initial reaction is moral revulsion. The advice to avoid unhappy people, to treat misfortune as a contagion, to select your associates on the basis of their luck and emotional condition rather than their character, is, on the surface, a counsel of extraordinary callousness. The person who follows this law consistently is a person who abandons the vulnerable, who treats the suffering as contaminated, who builds their social life as a carefully curated environment of success, while excluding everything that might complicate the picture. But Greene is not quite saying this. Or rather, he is saying this, but alongside something more psychologically precise and more honest. The psychological mechanism is real. Emotional states are genuinely contagious. The research on emotional contagion, the process by which exposure to another person's emotional state produces a similar state in the observer through automatic mimicry and neural entrainment, is robust and consistent. You're not immune to the emotions of the people around you. You're shaped by them continuously and largely below the level of conscious awareness. And there is a specific pattern, which Greene's historical examples document and which clinical observation confirms, in which certain people consistently generate negative outcomes not through bad luck in any straightforward sense, but through patterns of behaviour, perception, and relationship that reliably produce the situations they then suffer from. The person whose workplace relationships consistently collapse, the person whose financial decisions consistently produce the same crisis, the person whose health is consistently undermined by patterns that have specific behavioural components. These are not simply unlucky people. They are people whose patterns are producing their outcomes, and those patterns, the thinking, the decision-making, the relationship dynamics, are the contagious element. The moral dimension requires careful navigation. The law, applied without compassion, produces the social Darwinism that its surface reading suggests, a world in which the people who most need support are most thoroughly abandoned because their need for support is itself coded as a reason to exclude them. This is clearly wrong. Clearly, not just strategically wrong, morally wrong. The capacity to be present for people in difficulty, to extend care and support without requiring that they first demonstrate the emotional positivity that makes them safe to be around, is one of the central moral achievements of human character. But the law is not advising you to never care for the suffering. It is advising you to be honest about the effect of your social environment on your psychology, and to make conscious rather than unconscious choices about where you spend the energy and attention that the environment consumes. The person who spends all of their psychological resources in relationships that consistently deplete rather than nourish, who mistakes the willingness to be depleted for virtue, is not more moral than the person who maintains relationships that sustain them. They are simply less honest about the exchange. The wisdom in this law, stripped of its callous surface, is the wisdom of knowing that you are not infinitely resourced, that your emotional environment shapes your psychology, and that the choice of who you spend time with is not a morally neutral choice. It has consequences for who you become. And taking those consequences seriously, rather than pretending that moral goodness requires unlimited availability to every form of human suffering, is not callousness. It is honesty about the limits of what any person can actually offer. Power over others is, at its most fundamental, the power to provide or withhold something they need. And the person who wants to maintain power over time, who wants not just a moment of influence but a sustained position, must understand and actively cultivate the dependency that makes that position durable. Learn to keep people dependent on you. To maintain your independence, you must always be needed and wanted. The more you're relied on, the more freedom you have. Make people depend on you for their happiness and prosperity, and you have nothing to fear. Never teach them enough so that they can do without you. The historical example is the condottiere Castruccio Castracani, the 14th century Italian mercenary general who understood that the security of his position depended not on military victory. Victories could be followed by the elimination of the victor, who was no longer needed, but on making himself indispensable to the political powers he served. He managed this by never quite resolving the conflicts he was hired to resolve, by maintaining a state of managed tension that required his continued presence by ensuring that the need for his services never fully expired. The psychological mechanism is the substitution of dependency for quality. The person who is simply the best at something can be replaced when someone better appears. The person who has made themselves irreplaceable through dependency, through the cultivation of specific relationships, specific knowledge, specific access that cannot be reproduced by a competitor, is protected by something stickier than quality. The moral dimension is the darkest of any law we have encountered so far, because the advice to keep people dependent, to never teach them enough to do without you, to maintain a state of need that serves your power rather than their development, is a direct inversion of what most of the relationships in which this strategy could be applied are supposed to be about. The teacher who keeps students dependent rather than developing independence. The therapist who fosters reliance rather than building the client's capacity for self-sufficiency. The manager who maintains information asymmetry rather than developing the team's capabilities. The partner who undermines their companion's confidence in order to ensure the companion cannot imagine functioning without them. All of these are applications of Law 11. All of them are recognizable. All of them are practiced, often without the practitioner's conscious acknowledgement. And all of them represent a fundamental betrayal of the relational commitment that makes the position possible. The commitment to the student's learning, the client's healing, the team's development, the partner's flourishing. The law works as a power strategy. As a relational ethic, it is precisely backward. Honesty, wielded strategically, is the most effective deception. This is the disturbing insight at the heart of Law 12, and it is the law that most thoroughly dissolves the comfortable separation between deception and honesty as moral categories. Use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. One sincere and honest move will cover over dozens of dishonest ones. Open-hearted gestures of honesty and generosity bring down the guard of even the most suspicious people. Once your selective honesty opens a hole in their armor, you can deceive and manipulate them at will. The historical example is the Trojan horse, the most famous act of strategic generosity in Western literature. The Greeks, after 10 years of unsuccessful siege, offered the Trojans a magnificent gift, a giant wooden horse, ostensibly as an offering to Athena, actually containing the soldiers who would open the city's gates from within. The Trojans, disarmed by the generosity, brought the horse inside. By morning, Troy was burning. The psychological mechanism is the specific operation of trust and its manipulation. Humans calibrate their level of openness to others based on their assessment of trustworthiness. The genuinely honest act, the genuine disclosure, the genuine gift, the moment of real vulnerability, is a powerful signal of trustworthiness because genuine honesty is costly and therefore hard to fake. When you are honest about something that cost you, the listener's assessment of your trustworthiness rises because they recognize that a strategic actor would not have made that disclosure. What Law 12 describes is the use of this recognition as a cover operation. The selective honest act, the disclosure, the gesture, the moment of apparent vulnerability, is genuine enough to produce the trustworthiness signal while concealing the broader strategic context within which it sits. The listener's guard comes down, the manufactured trust provides access, and the access is used for purposes that the manufactured trust was never meant to serve. This is the most sophisticated form of deception precisely because it operates through honesty. It does not require lying. It requires the strategic deployment of truth, the selection of which truths to disclose, at which moment, in which framing, to produce a false impression of the whole while remaining technically accurate about each disclosed part. The moral dimension is stark. The person who uses genuine honesty strategically, who makes real disclosures for the purpose of manufacturing trust rather than for the purpose of authentic communication, has done something that most ethical frameworks would classify as a serious violation, even though no individual statement they made was false. They have used the form of authentic relationship to serve the function of its opposite. And yet the practice is ubiquitous. It is the foundation of most sophisticated salesmanship. It is the core technique of political relationship building. It is present in varying degrees in most professional relationship management. The question is not whether it occurs, it does, but whether it can be used with sufficient consciousness and selectivity to remain within the bounds of ethical practice. Whether there is a version of strategic honesty that is not fundamentally a betrayal of the people it engages. Greene's book does not answer this question. The law simply describes the mechanism and notes its effectiveness. The moral work is left to the reader. This is both the book's greatest strength and its greatest limitation. You need something from someone who has more power than you. How do you ask? The naive answer, the answer that most people's social conditioning produces, is to appeal to the relationship, to invoke gratitude, if you have done things for this person, to appeal to mercy if you're in difficulty, to make your need visible and hope that the human capacity for generosity will be activated by the visibility of the need. This strategy fails more often than it succeeds, not because the people you're asking are deficient in mercy or gratitude, but because mercy and gratitude, in the context of a power request, require the powerful person to give something without receiving something, to respond to your need as the primary reason for the response. And the powerful person's position depends, in part, on the consistent management of these requests, because the number of people who can make credible claims on mercy or gratitude is large, and the resources available to respond to all of them is limited. When asking for help, appeal to self-interest, never to mercy or gratitude. If you need to turn to an ally for help, do not bother to remind him of your past assistance and good deeds. He may feel gratitude, but he will also feel burdened. Instead, uncover something in your request that will benefit him and emphasize it out of all proportion. He will respond enthusiastically when he sees something to be gained for himself. The historical example is the artist Michelangelo and his patron Pope Julius II, one of the most famously difficult relationships in the history of art patronage. Michelangelo was a genius. He was also, by temperament, almost uniquely unsuited to the management of powerful patrons, prone to abandoning commissions, to making demands, to invoking his own importance as the reason his request should be honoured. The advice Greene extracts from the observation of more successful court artists is the advice to reframe every request as an opportunity for the patron. Not, I need your support because of what I've done for you, but supporting me will produce these specific benefits for your legacy, your power, your reputation. The appeal to self-interest is not dishonest. If the project is genuinely valuable, the benefits to the patron are genuine. But the framing places the response to the request in the patron's interest rather than in the petitioner's need, which transforms the dynamic from charity to exchange. The psychological mechanism is the one we have encountered before. The powerful person responds to reasons that activate their own interests, not to emotions that activate their sympathy. Sympathy is pleasant but insufficient. It competes with every other claim on sympathy, and it costs the sympathizer something without providing anything in return. Self-interest is compelling. It aligns the response with the respondent's own motivations and costs them nothing that they were not already willing to spend. The moral dimension is about the reduction of relationship to transaction, the consistent application of this law, the reframing of every request as a transaction, the relentless identification of the other party's self-interest as the primary lever, produces a relational world in which appeals to mercy or gratitude are coded as weakness or manipulation, in which every interaction is evaluated for its exchange value, in which the genuine human response to need, the response that is not mediated by calculation, becomes unavailable as a mode. This is not a trivial cost. The world organized entirely by self-interest appeals is a colder world, a less human world, a world in which certain kinds of vulnerability cannot be expressed because the expression of them activates calculation rather than care. Information is power. In any competitive environment, any environment where different parties have different interests and the outcomes are not predetermined, the party with better information about the other party's actual positions, intentions, vulnerabilities, and constraints has a structural advantage that all the strategic skill in the world cannot compensate for. Pose as a friend, work as a spy. Knowing about your rival is critical. Use spies to gather valuable information that will keep you a step ahead. Better still, play the spy yourself. In polite social encounters, learn to probe. Ask indirect questions to get people to reveal their weaknesses and intentions. The historical example is Joseph Duveen, the most powerful art dealer of the early 20th century, who built his extraordinary position partly through a network of informants in the households of wealthy collectors, butlers, secretaries, household staff, who provided him with information about his clients' interests, anxieties, financial situations, and relationship dynamics. Armed with this intelligence, Duveen was able to approach each collector with an offer calibrated precisely to what they needed at that moment, emotionally, financially, socially. His success appeared to be the result of extraordinary taste and relationship skill. It was, in significant part, the result of superior information. The psychological mechanism is the fundamental asymmetry between the person who knows more and the person who knows less in any interaction. The spy advantage is not just tactical, it is psychological. Knowing what the other person is actually thinking while they do not know what you are actually thinking produces a specific kind of confidence and a specific kind of control that no amount of strategic sophistication can fully replicate without that informational foundation. The moral dimension is the most directly troubling in the entire book. Posing as a friend in order to extract information, using the trust that friendship creates as an intelligence-gathering mechanism, is a form of deception so fundamental that it undermines not just the individual relationship but the social institution of friendship itself. If friendship is routinely used as a cover for information extraction, the signal that friendship sends, "I trust you with access to my actual thoughts and feelings," becomes corrupted. The rational response, in a world where Law 14 is widely practiced, is to give no one that access, to treat every expression of friendly interest as potentially strategic, to close the gap between the presented self and the actual self that friendship is one of the few social structures designed to bridge. This is a very high social cost, and it is, arguably, a cost that is already being paid in environments, certain corporate cultures, certain political environments, certain social scenes, where the strategic use of social intelligence is sufficiently prevalent that the baseline trust required for genuine relationship has been severely eroded. The person who knows this law is happening to them, who can recognize the posing friend as a potential spy, is better positioned than the person who does not. But the best use of that positioning is not to respond in kind. It is to choose their social environment more carefully, to be honest about who is actually a friend and who is performing friendship, and to offer genuine friendship only to the people who are capable of receiving it as such, rather than mining it as data. The 15th law is the one that most directly confronts the reader with what the full pursuit of power requires of the person who pursues it. There is no softening available. There is no alternative reading. The law says what it says. Crush your enemy totally. All great leaders since Moses have known that a feared enemy must be crushed completely. If one ember is left alight, no matter how dimly it smoulders, a fire will eventually break out. More is lost through stopping halfway than through total annihilation. The enemy will recover and will seek revenge. Crush him, not only in body but in spirit. The historical example is the first Ming Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang, who rose from peasant poverty to found the Ming dynasty through a series of military campaigns characterized by total, comprehensive destruction of defeated enemies and their family networks. Leaving survivors was not mercy. It was the planting of future enemies, people with motive, memory, and eventually the opportunity for revenge. Yuanzhang understood this with the clarity of someone who had come from nothing and knew that the same conditions that had produced his rise could produce the rise of someone else's revenge. The psychological mechanism is the mathematics of incomplete victory. A defeated enemy who survives is not neutral. They are motivated. The defeat has added the specific, powerful motivation of revenge to whatever previous motivation they had. And motivation, given time and even modest resources, tends to produce action. History's graveyards are full of rulers who spared enemies out of confidence, out of magnanimity, out of the belief that the defeat was complete enough to be permanent, and who were eventually destroyed by exactly the people they had declined to destroy. This is strategic reality. It is not comfortable, but it is real. The record of incomplete victories followed by revenge is too consistent to be dismissed as exceptional. The moral dimension of Law 15 is where this documentary must be most direct. The advice to crush your enemy totally, to destroy not only their capacity but their spirit, to leave not one ember of resistance, is a description of cruelty as strategic necessity. It is the law that most clearly shows the reader where the full logic of the power game leads, to the elimination of mercy as a category, to the conversion of every conflict into an existential contest that must be won completely or lost completely, to the specific moral world of the person for whom no enemy can be spared, because every enemy is a potential future threat. This is not a world that most people want to inhabit. The people who do inhabit it, who have followed the logic of power to this conclusion, are recognizable in the historical record. They are effective. They are feared. They are, in the narrow strategic sense, protected. And they are, in almost every case, comprehensively alone, surrounded by people who have not been crushed and who are therefore potential threats. Unable to extend anything that resembles trust, because trust requires the acceptance of vulnerability, and vulnerability to a person who crushes enemies totally is unacceptable. The logic of Law 15 followed consistently produces not only the destruction of enemies, it produces the destruction of the self that existed before the pursuit of power made this logic seem necessary. The ember of mercy, extinguished to protect strategic position, is not replaced by anything. It simply becomes a cold place in what was once a warmer person. This is the cost that the law does not mention, not because Greene missed it, because accounting for it is not the book's project, it is this documentary's project, and we will not stop mentioning it. Everything that is always available becomes worthless. This is not cynicism. It is economics, it is psychology, it is the operating principle of every market and every relationship that has ever existed. The thing you can have whenever you want it, the food that is always on the table, the person who is always available, the experience that is always accessible, is valued at a fraction of the same thing experienced as scarce. Use absence to increase respect and honour. Too much circulation makes the price go down. The more you are seen and heard from, the more common you appear. If you're already established in a group, temporary withdrawal from it will make you more talked about, even more admired. You must learn when to leave, create value through scarcity. Greene's primary example is the Romantic poet Lord Byron, the most famous celebrity of the early 19th century and arguably the first person to consciously manage their own celebrity as a strategic asset. Byron understood intuitively what the law makes explicit, that the desire of the public was not for Byron's constant presence but for Byron's occasional presence following a period of absence. The anticipation produced by his withdrawals, the mystery generated by his departures to the continent, the rumoured adventures and scandals of the absent period, all of this created a hunger that his actual return satisfied, and his constant presence would have dissipated. The psychological mechanism is the dopamine system and its relationship to intermittent reinforcement. The brain's reward response to any consistent, predictable stimulus diminishes with repetition. This is the process of habituation, the mechanism by which the extraordinary becomes ordinary through familiarity. The brain's reward response to an intermittent, unpredictable stimulus does not diminish. It intensifies. The variable schedule of reinforcement produces a stronger and more durable motivational response than any consistent schedule. This is the mechanism behind gambling's addictiveness, behind the specific torture of the partner who is inconsistently affectionate, behind the authority figure who is unpredictably available. All of these are applications, conscious or unconscious, of the principle that absence increases desire. The moral dimension is about the relationship between authentic presence and strategic withdrawal. The person who manages their availability purely as a power instrument, who withdraws not because they need to, but because absence increases their value, who appears not because they want to connect, but because the appearance after the absence generates the maximum desire, has converted presence into a performance and absence into a manipulation. They are not in relationship, they are managing a market. The genuine wisdom in this law is the simpler observation that not everything you have to offer should be offered all the time. That some of the most valuable things you can do for a relationship, professional, personal, creative, is to occasionally withdraw and allow the space to generate its own form of respect. The person who is always present, always available, always responsive, eventually trains the people around them to expect the constant availability as the baseline, and to value it at zero, because it is never experienced in contrast to absence. This is the law that most directly describes what we now call psychological abuse. Keep others in suspended terror. Cultivate an air of unpredictability. Humans are creatures of habit with an insatiable need to see familiarity in other people's actions. Your predictability gives them a sense of control. Turn the tables. Be deliberately unpredictable. Behavior that seems to have no consistency or purpose will keep them off balance, and they will wear themselves out trying to explain your moves. The historical example is Bobby Fischer, the American chess prodigy who weaponized unpredictability in his negotiations with tournament organizers and opponents. Fischer's demands were mercurial, his compliance was unreliable, his behavior was deliberately difficult to model, and the result was that every person who needed something from Fischer was in a permanent state of anxious uncertainty, unable to plan around him, unable to predict his responses, unable to do anything except remain in a heightened state of attention to whatever signal he might give next. The mechanism is the anxiety that the absence of pattern generates. Human cognition is fundamentally pattern-matching cognition. We predict the behavior of others by identifying their patterns, their consistent responses to consistent stimuli, and then using those patterns to calibrate our own responses. When someone's behavior is genuinely unpredictable, when no pattern can be identified, when the expected response is not produced, when the same input produces wildly different outputs, the cognitive system that depends on pattern matching cannot function. The result is anxiety, the specific, exhausting, attention-consuming anxiety of perpetual uncertainty about what is coming next. That anxiety is control. The person who generates it has captured the attention and the emotional resources of everyone around them. And captured attention is the foundation of the specific kind of power that this law describes. The moral dimension is unambiguous. Deliberately cultivating unpredictability in order to keep others in anxiety is the description of an abusive relationship dynamic. It is the mechanism of coercive control in intimate partner abuse, of the toxic workplace culture where the boss's moods determine everyone's day, of the authoritarian political environment where the ruler's arbitrariness is maintained as a governance tool. In each of these contexts, the psychological costs to the people living in the unpredictability are real and serious. Chronic stress, hypervigilance, the inability to plan or function with the cognitive resources that are being consumed by constant uncertainty management. This law describes a real power mechanism. It is also a description of how to damage people psychologically for strategic advantage. Those two statements coexist. The law works. It is also cruel. Here, for the first time in the book, Greene advises against a strategy that the fear of power's dangers might instinctively generate. The person who has been burned by others' use of power might conclude that the safest response is withdrawal, that the way to avoid being vulnerable to the game is to leave the game, to build walls, to reduce exposure, to control the environment by shrinking it to a size that can be managed. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. The world is dangerous and enemies are everywhere. Everyone has to protect themselves. A fortress seems the safest. but isolation exposes you to more dangers than it protects you from. It cuts you off from valuable information, it makes you conspicuous and an easy target. Better to circulate among people, find allies, mingle. The historical example is the last Inca emperor Atahualpa, who, having heard reports of the approaching Spanish forces under Pizarro, withdrew to his military camp in the highlands and waited, confident that his power and his position and his surrounding army would protect him. The isolation turned out to be catastrophic. Cut off from the flow of information about the Spanish forces and their capabilities, Atahualpa made a series of decisions based on assumptions about the invaders that were completely wrong. When Pizarro's force of fewer than 200 men encountered an Inca army of tens of thousands, the Inca emperor was captured in the first minutes of the encounter. Captured, not because he lacked power, but because his isolation had deprived him of the accurate information that power requires to be exercised effectively. The psychological mechanism is the specific way in which isolation amplifies rather than reduces threat. The isolated person is cut off from the information that would allow accurate assessment of actual threats. They substitute their own assumptions, their own fears, their own projections for the reality that they are no longer in contact with. And those assumptions, fears, and projections are consistently worse than reality, because the imagination of threat, operating without the corrective of actual information, tends toward the extreme. The isolated person is both more frightened and less prepared than the person who stays in circulation. The moral dimension here is interesting. This is one of the laws that is less about manipulation than about a genuine strategic error that Greene is advising against. The wisdom is real. Isolation costs more than it protects. The person who retreats from the social world in response to its dangers loses the information, the alliances, and the contextual understanding that navigating those dangers actually requires. Not all targets respond the same way. Not all opposition is the same opposition. The strategy that works on one kind of person will provoke a completely different and entirely unexpected response from another. Know who you're dealing with, do not offend the wrong person. There are many different kinds of people in the world, and you can never assume that everyone will react to your strategies in the same way. Deceive or outmaneuver some people, and they will spend the rest of their lives seeking revenge. They simply cannot let it go. It is critical that you know beforehand with whom you are dealing. Greene identifies 5 types of person that the power seeker must distinguish between. The arrogant and proud man, who cannot tolerate any challenge to his sense of superiority and will react to slights with disproportionate force. The insecure and sensitive man, who appears open but conceals wounds and grievances that erupt unexpectedly. The suspicious man, who interprets every move as a potential threat and whose defensive reactions are comprehensive and unrelenting. The serpent with a long memory, who absorbs an offense without visible reaction and waits, sometimes for years, for the moment of reversal. And the plain and honest person, who may seem the safest target because they lack the sophistication for elaborate revenge, but who will respond to disrespect with a directness and persistence that sophistication does not match. The psychological mechanism is the fundamental heterogeneity of human response systems. People have different threat thresholds, different capacities for grievance retention, different timescales for response, different styles of retaliation. The strategic actor who applies a uniform approach to all targets will inevitably activate exactly the kind of response they were trying to avoid in the people whose response system is most sensitive to that approach. The law is both strategic wisdom and, in a different frame, a counsel of basic social intelligence. The advice to understand the person you are dealing with before acting is not manipulative in any inherently troubling sense. It is simply the recognition that other people are as complex as you are, that their responses are shaped by histories you may not know, and that the failure to account for that complexity produces avoidable conflict. This law is the one that the people who most need to hear it will most resist, and they will resist it for the same reason they need it, because their tendency to overcommit, to make their loyalties visible, to align publicly with one party or another before the situation has fully resolved, is the exact vulnerability that the law is designed to correct. Do not commit to anyone. It is the fool who always rushes to take sides. Do not commit to any side or cause but yourself. By maintaining your independence, you become the master of others, playing people against each other, making them pursue you. The historical example is Queen Elizabeth I of England, whose 45-year reign was partly built on an almost pathological non-commitment. the perpetual suggestion of potential alliance, marriage, or agreement with every party seeking her commitment, without the actual delivery of that commitment to any of them. She kept the princes of Europe perpetually hopeful and permanently uncertain, which maintained for England a diplomatic flexibility that none of her committed contemporaries could match. The psychological mechanism is the power of the uncommitted position in any competitive environment. The party that commits first has revealed their position, which allows every other party to calibrate their response to it. The party that does not commit retains all options, forces the committed parties to compete for their alignment, and can extract maximum value from the commitment when they finally make it. The moral dimension is about the cost to the people who are pursuing your commitment. The strategy described in Law 20, maintaining the appearance of potential commitment while never delivering it, is a specific form of the managed hope that makes engagement with power relationships so often exhausting and demoralizing. The person on the receiving end of perpetual non-commitment is not being treated as a person. They are being treated as a strategic asset whose value derives from their uncertainty about your position. The genuine wisdom in this law, the wisdom that does not require the manipulative dimension, is the simpler observation that premature commitment is a strategic error, that there is real value in maintaining enough flexibility to respond to changing circumstances, that the person who has committed irrevocably to a position before all information is available has purchased certainty at the cost of accuracy. Intelligence displayed too openly is a threat. The person who visibly outthinks the people around them generates envy, resistance, and the specific hostility of people who do not like being made to feel lesser. And the person who needs something from those people, whose strategic goals require their cooperation, cannot afford that hostility. Play a sucker to catch a sucker, seem dumber than your mark. No one likes feeling stupider than the next person. The trick, then, is to make your victims feel smart. And not just smart, but smarter than you. Once convinced of this, they will never suspect that you may have ulterior motives. The historical example is the Persian king Cyrus, who defeated his enemy Astyages by appearing naive and over-trusting, allowing Astyages to believe that Cyrus was an uncomplicated young man whose ambitions could be managed, right up to the moment that Cyrus's army destroyed the Median forces. The mechanism is the lowered guard that apparent inferiority produces. The person who believes they are smarter than you stops monitoring you as a threat. Their attention shifts from the risk you pose to the opportunity your apparent simplicity represents. And in that shift, in that relaxation of vigilance, the space for genuine strategy opens. The moral dimension is about the ethics of performed vulnerability and what it does to relationships based on perceived status. The person who performs inferiority to obtain advantage has deceived the other party in a specific way. They have allowed a false impression of relative capability to stand and have used the false impression strategically. The trust generated is false trust. The relationship built on the false impression is built on a misrepresentation. Confrontation with overwhelming force is not courage, it is waste. Use the surrender tactic, transform the weakness into power. When you are weaker, never fight for honor's sake. Choose surrender instead. Surrender gives you time to recover, time to torment and irritate your conqueror, time to wait for his power to wane. Do not give him the satisfaction of fighting and defeating you. Surrender first. The mechanism here is the counterintuitive power of strategic defeat. The general who surrenders on terms, who converts the defeat into a negotiated arrangement that preserves something, has more options than the general who fights to destruction. The employee who yields a battle with a superior, without yielding the war of eventual positioning, has preserved their capacity for future influence. The person who does not insist on being right in every immediate confrontation preserves the relationship that will allow them to be right in the ones that matter. This is the law that most directly contradicts the honor culture's injunction to fight every challenge. And it is, in the environments where honor culture is strongest, where backing down is coded as weakness that invites more challenge, the most counterintuitive and most valuable piece of strategic advice in the book. Because honor culture is a trap for exactly the people it claims to protect, the people whose pride is most easily activated, who will fight costly battles to preserve an image of strength that the fights themselves undermine. The moral dimension is about the relationship between dignity and strategic calculation. There are situations, moral situations, situations involving genuine principle rather than ego, where surrender is not a strategy, but a capitulation that costs something that cannot be recovered. the law does not address this distinction. Greene's framework is consistently strategic rather than moral. Knowing the difference between a battle that can be strategically conceded and one that cannot be surrendered without genuine loss is the reader's work, not the law's. Disperse strength is no strength. Concentrate your forces. Conserve your forces and energies by keeping them concentrated at their strongest point. You gain more by finding a rich mine and mining it deeper than by flitting from one shallow mine to another. Intensity defeats extensity every time. When looking for sources of power to elevate you, find the one key patron, the fat cow who will give you milk for a long time to come. The historical example is Nikola Tesla, reappearing in Greene's narrative now, in a different role, as the cautionary examples of dispersed brilliance. Tesla had more genuine ideas than almost any inventor of his era. He also had less commercial success than Edison, Westinghouse, or dozens of lesser intellects, because his genius could not resist the next idea long enough to mine any single one to its commercial depth. The intensity of concentration that commercial success requires, the willingness to focus completely on one thing until it is fully developed, was unavailable to a mind that was always being pulled toward the next extraordinary thing. The mechanism is the compound return on concentrated effort. Every domain of excellence, every field, every skill, every relationship has a depth dimension that reveals itself only to sustained, concentrated engagement. The surface is accessible to casual attention. What lies beneath requires the commitment of focus over time, and what lies beneath the surface, the insight, the mastery, the relationships, is where the disproportionate returns are. The moral dimension is minimal here. This is one of the laws that functions more as strategic wisdom than manipulation. The advice to concentrate forces is advice about the allocation of personal resources, time, attention, energy, in a way that maximizes their effectiveness. It is not advice about how to treat other people, it is advice about how to treat your own capacities. Every institution has a court, not the medieval version with literal thrones and actual courtiers. The functional court, the environment organized around a center of power, where proximities to that center confers status, and where the management of the center's perception of you is the primary political activity. Play the perfect courtier. The perfect courtier thrives in a world where everything revolves around power and political dexterity. He has mastered the art of indirection. He flatters, yields to superiors, and asserts power over others in the most oblique and graceful manner. Learn and apply the laws of court politics. Greene identifies specific courtier skills, the ability to adapt your style to your audience, to never criticize superiors directly, to use flattery intelligently, to never be the bearer of bad news, to be the master of small talk, to never outshine the master. The perfect courtier navigates the court environment with a specific, refined, almost artistic mastery of social dynamics, making each interaction serve their strategic position without the interaction appearing strategic. The historical example is the Duke of Richelieu, who served multiple masters across decades of extraordinarily volatile court politics by mastering the art of making each master feel uniquely valued and uniquely understood while maintaining the flexibility to serve whoever held the power at any given moment. The mechanism is the social intelligence that the court environment specifically rewards. Courts, and their modern equivalents, are environments where formal rules are less determinative than informal dynamics, where what is said matters less than how it is said, where relationships are the primary currency, and where the ability to navigate those relationships with skill and grace is the central competency. The moral dimension of the perfect courtier's art is about authenticity, and what is lost when every interaction is calibrated to strategic effect. The courtier who has completely mastered the art of saying the right thing to the right person at the right moment has purchased influence at the cost of ever being genuinely known. Every relationship is a performance. Every response is calculated. The spontaneous, uncalibrated, genuinely feeling person that exists underneath the courtier's art has been so thoroughly managed that, in time, it becomes unclear whether they still exist at all. The self you were given, the identity formed by accident of birth, family, culture, the specific history that happened to you, is not the only self available to you. Recreate yourself. Do not accept the role that society foists on you. Recreate yourself by forging a new identity, one that commands attention and never bores the audience. Be the master of your own image rather than letting others define it for you. Incorporate dramatic devices into your public persona, and your actions will seem larger and more commanding. The historical example is Julius Caesar, who transformed himself from a minor, debt-ridden aristocrat of undistinguished family into the dominant political figure of the Roman world, partly through a deliberate, systematic management of his public image. The military campaigns selected for their dramatic narrative value as much as their strategic necessity, the public speeches designed to position him as the people's champion against the Senate's corruption, the personal style maintained with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that image is power. The mechanism is the human brain's responsiveness to narrative. We organize our understanding of people and events through story, through the narrative structures of character, conflict, and arc that make information memorable and emotionally engaging. The person who understands this, and who manages their public persona as a narrative rather than simply as a set of accomplishments and qualities, has access to forms of influence that the person who simply is things, without managing the story of being them, does not. The moral dimension is about authenticity and performance. The advice to recreate yourself, to craft a public persona that is designed for effect rather than simply emerging from genuine character, raises the question of what the relationship between the crafted persona and the actual person should be. Greene is not advising inauthenticity in any simple sense. He's observing that identity itself is always to some degree constructed, that the self is not a fixed given but an ongoing project, and that the conscious management of that construction is superior to allowing others to define you by default. This is genuinely true, and the person who has been defined by others' narratives, whose identity has been constructed by their family's expectations, their community's assumptions, their institution's categories, has every reason to exercise the law's advice to reclaim authorship of their own story. The question is whether the reclaimed authorship is in service of genuine self-expression or in service of strategic image management. Both use the same tools, the destinations are very different. Power requires the appearance of innocence. This is not a peripheral feature of the power dynamic. It is central. The person who is visibly responsible for everything they actually do has already lost the specific advantage that deniability provides. Keep your hands clean. You must seem a paragon of civility and efficiency. Your hands are never soiled by mistakes and nasty deeds. Maintain such a spotless appearance by using others as scapegoats and cat's paws to disguise your involvement. Greene's historical examples include Cesare Borgia, the Renaissance prince who was Machiavelli's model for the prince, and who consistently used lieutenants to execute his most brutal strategies, and then, when those strategies had served their purpose, publicly punished the lieutenants for the very actions he had commissioned them to perform. The cruelty was Caesar's. The hands were clean. The mechanism is the cognitive asymmetry between visible and invisible causation. People assign moral responsibility to visible actors. The person whose hands are on the instrument is blamed. The person who held the instrument is not seen. And the management of this assignment, the deliberate structuring of operations so that the most damaging actions are performed by visible subordinates, while the directing intelligence remains at one remove, is one of the most consistently practiced strategies in political and organizational history. The moral dimension is the straightforward ethics of scapegoating and how it destroys the people it uses. The subordinate who is punished for actions commissioned by the superior has been instrumentalized in the most complete sense, used, in the first instance, as a tool to execute the superior's will, and then, in the second, as a tool to absorb the moral consequences of that will. They were not an agent, they were a mechanism, and the mechanism, having served its purpose, is discarded with the responsibility attached to it. The person who practices this law consistently eventually surrounds themselves with people who know what they are, who have understood the structure of the relationship and have calibrated their own behavior accordingly. They do not trust the person who uses them as a cat's paw. They cannot. The person who has demonstrated willingness to sacrifice subordinates to maintain their own clean hands has provided the most complete possible evidence about the limits of their loyalty. And in the knowledge of those limits, the relationship becomes purely transactional, both parties performing their roles, neither investing anything that the role does not require. This is another form of the specific loneliness that the pursuit of power consistently produces. People want to believe this is not a cynical observation. It is a description of something real and important in human psychology. The need for meaning, for a framework that makes sense of experience, for a community of shared purpose, for a figure who embodies the understanding that you have been seeking. These are genuine needs. They are among the most specifically human needs there are, and they are, for exactly that reason, among the most dangerous vulnerabilities to exploitation. Play on people's need to believe to create a cult-like following. People have an overwhelming desire to believe in something. Become the focal point of such desire by offering them a cause, a new faith to follow. Keep your words vague but full of promise. Emphasize enthusiasm over rationality and clear thinking. Give your followers rituals to perform. Ask them to make sacrifices on your behalf. In the absence of organized religion and grand causes, your new belief system will bring you untold power. The historical example is the Count of Cagliostro, an 18th century con artist of extraordinary sophistication who built a following across European courts by offering a specific combination of mysticism, flattery, and the promise of secret knowledge accessible only through him. He found his most receptive audiences in exactly the environments where official religion had lost its grip on the educated classes, the rational, skeptical Enlightenment aristocracy who no longer found comfort in the church, but still had the human need for mystery and meaning that the church had previously served. The mechanism is the specific vulnerability that meaning hunger creates. The person who lacks a framework for understanding their experience, who is in the specific state of having outgrown one system of meaning without yet finding another, is in the state of maximum susceptibility to whoever offers the next system convincingly. And the offering does not need to be true. It needs to be compelling. It needs to engage the emotional register where meaning is felt, rather than the intellectual register where it is evaluated. It needs to create community, ritual, the sense of exclusive access to important knowledge, and a figure of sufficient authority and mystery to anchor the whole. These are the elements of the cult. And the cult, the full-scale, totalistic cult of the kind that history documents from the ancient mystery religions through the 20th century milieu through to the present, is the most complete expression of this law's logic. The leader who has persuaded a group to subordinate their individual judgment to his authority, who has established the terms within which reality is interpreted, who has created the social environment in which departure from the group's belief system is experienced as existential threat, that leader has achieved a form of power over the people in the group that is more complete than almost any other form of human domination. The moral dimension is the clearest in the book. The exploitation of meaning hunger, the deliberate manufacture of a belief system not because you believe it, but because belief is the mechanism of control, is a profound violation of the human being's most specifically human capacity. The capacity for meaning-making, the capacity for genuine belief, the capacity to organize your life around something you actually take to be true, rather than something you have been manipulated into appearing to take to be true. The person who follows this law consistently is the person who has looked at the most human of human needs and decided to use it as a power tool. Nothing in the book describes a more complete form of moral degradation. Timidity is not safety. This is the counterintuitive insight at the core of Law 28, and it has specific, practical, psychologically grounded reasons for being true. Enter action with boldness. If you are unsure of a course of action, do not attempt it. Your doubts and hesitations will infect your execution. Timidity is dangerous. Better to enter with boldness. Any mistakes you commit through audacity are easily corrected with more audacity. Everyone admires the bold, no one honors the timid. The historical example is the Italian artist Aretino, whose career was built on the specific power of bold, unhedged attack. Aretino wrote savage satires of the most powerful figures in Europe and sent them directly to those figures, not as private communications, as public performances. His audacity was so complete, so apparently fearless, that it generated exactly the response it was designed to generate. Not punishment, but fascination. Not destruction, but negotiation. The powerful figures who might have had him killed instead paid him to stop, which was, of course, what he was after. The mechanism is the psychological effect of confidence on everyone who encounters it. Confidence, genuine or perform, activates a specific cognitive heuristic. This person believes in what they are doing, and belief correlates with knowledge, and knowledge correlates with capability. The confident person appears to know something. The timid person appears to doubt. And in any situation where direct knowledge is unavailable, the appearance of confidence substitutes for it. This is why the con artist's primary tool is confidence. Not charm, not intelligence, not elaborate preparation, though all of these matter. Confidence, the specific, unhedged, apparently certain projection of competence that triggers the trust heuristic in the person being conned before they have had a chance to evaluate the actual competence. The moral dimension of this law is less about manipulation than about the relationship between how you act and what you believe about yourself and the action. The advice to enter boldly is partly the advice that in most situations, the failure to act is more costly than the failure of an imperfect action. The person who hesitates and loses the opportunity has not been safe. They have been exposed to a different risk, the risk of inaction, that timidity consistently underweights, because inaction's costs are less visible than actions. The person who plans to the middle of the operation and improvises from there is in the specific danger of an explorer who sets out for a destination without having planned the return journey. Plan all the way to the end. The ending is everything. Plan all the way to it, taking into account all the possible consequences, obstacles, and twists of fortune that might reverse your hard work and give the glory to others. By planning to the end, you will not be overwhelmed by circumstances and you will know when to stop. The historical example is Hannibal's Italian campaign, the most brilliant military campaign in ancient history, which crossed the Alps with war elephants and defeated Rome in battle after battle, and which ultimately failed because the brilliant tactical planning that produced the victories was not connected to a strategic plan that included how the victories would be converted into the actual defeat of Rome. Hannibal could win battles indefinitely. He could not win the war because the plan had never been extended to the ending. The mechanism is the specific cognitive bias toward near-term planning that most human thinking exhibits. The immediate challenge, the obstacle directly in front of you, is vivid, concrete, and available to detailed planning. The distant challenge, the problem that will arise after the current one is solved, is abstract, hypothetical, and therefore consistently underweighted. The result is a systematic overinvestment in solving immediate problems and underinvestment in the problems that the solutions create. The moral dimension is minimal here. This is strategic wisdom more than manipulation. The advice to plan all the way to the end is the advice that goals have consequences, that the achievement of a goal creates new situations that were not necessarily anticipated, and that the failure to anticipate them is not good fortune but planning failure. Effort is unflattering. This is one of the less obvious but more broadly applicable observations in Greene's framework, and its practical implications extend far beyond the specific power contexts he describes. Make your accomplishments seem effortless. Your actions must seem natural and executed with ease. All the toil and practice that goes into them, and also all the clever tricks, must be concealed. When you act effortlessly, as if you could do much more. Avoid the temptation of revealing how hard you work. It only raises questions. The historical example is the Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, the greatest duelist in Japanese history, whose aesthetic of effortless mastery, the appearance that his extraordinary skill cost him nothing, that the perfection of his technique was simply the natural expression of his nature, was as much a power tool as the technique itself. Opponents who believed they were facing effortless mastery were in a different psychological state than opponents who believed they were facing worked-at skill. The effortless impression created a specific kind of discouragement. The opponent who sees perfection without effort feels that the gap between themselves and their opponent is unbridgeable in a way that evidence of effort would have made bridgeable. The mechanism is the sprezzatura described by Castiglione in the Book of the Courtier. The cultivation of the appearance that skill and grace cost nothing. The court that operates smoothly, the speech that flows without hesitation, the physical performance that shows no strain, all of these communicate mastery at a level that the visible effort of achievement cannot. Because effort signals incompleteness. It says, "This is difficult for me." And difficulty is a frame that prepares the audience to see limitations before they have appeared. The moral dimension is about the social cost of the concealment of effort, and what the concealment does to the people around you who are also making effort. The world organized by the concealment of effort is a world in which the appearance of effortlessness becomes the standard, in which the person who shows they're working, who admits their struggle, who is visibly doing the difficult thing, is coded as less capable than the person who conceals the same difficulty behind a facade of ease. This is a form of social pressure that produces real suffering, the suffering of people who are doing their work with genuine effort and genuine difficulty, watching those around them perform effortlessness, and concluding that the difficulty is theirs alone. Freedom of choice is one of the most powerful psychological needs in the human repertoire. The sense of agency, the feeling that you are deciding rather than being decided, is so important to psychological well-being that its removal is experienced as a form of assault. Control the options, get others to play with the cards you deal. The best deceptions are the ones that seem to give the other person a choice. Your victims feel they are in control, but are actually your puppets. Give people options that come out in your favour, whichever one they choose. Force them to make choices between the lesser of two evils, both of which serve your purpose. The historical example is Ivan the Terrible, the 16th century Russian Tsar, who controlled the boyars' political options by creating a situation in which every available choice for the boyar class led to outcomes that served Ivan's consolidation of power. The freedom to choose was maintained. The options available to choose from were controlled. The mechanism is the specific cognitive effect of illusory control. People who feel they are making choices are more committed to the outcomes of those choices than people who feel they have been imposed on. The perceived agency of the choice, even when the choice is between options that all serve the same master, produces ownership of the outcome. The person who has chosen their constraint experiences it differently from the person who has had the same constraint imposed. This is the mechanism behind much of what is called democratic legitimacy, the sense that the political system's outcomes are acceptable in part because there was a process of choice, even when the available choices were all organised within a framework that was not itself chosen. The illusion of control is not a trivial thing. It is one of the most important mechanisms by which compliance is maintained in complex societies. The moral dimension is about the gap between the experience of choice and the reality of it, and what it means to deliberately engineer that gap in order to extract compliance while avoiding resistance. Reality is hard, reality is specific. Reality has edges and friction and the persistent wearing quality of not being quite what you wanted. Fantasy is soft, accommodating, responsive to desire, organisable around wish, play to people's fantasies. The truth is often avoided because it is ugly and unpleasant. Never appeal to truth and reality unless you are prepared for the anger that comes from disenchantment. Life is so harsh and distressing that people who can manufacture romance or conjure up fantasy are like oases in the desert. Everyone flocks to them. The historical example is Cesare Borgia again, here in the role of the person who managed the fantasies of his political allies and subjects with the skill of a master storyteller. Borgia understood that what people wanted from him was not accurate information about his plans and capabilities. They wanted a figure who embodied their fantasies about power, about protection, about the exciting possibility of being connected to someone truly exceptional. He provided the figure. The actual capabilities were beside the point of the fantasy. The mechanism is the preference for narrative over reality that the human brain systematically exhibits. We are story-processing creatures. The story, the one with the hero and the purpose and the satisfying arc, is more available to our cognitive systems, more emotionally engaging, more memorable and more motivating than the accurate, complex, ambiguous account of what is actually happening. The politician who tells the story wins over the policy wonk who tells the truth. The entrepreneur who describes the vision wins resources over the analyst who describes the risks. The lover who crafts the romance wins the heart over the person who describes the relationship's actual dynamics. The moral dimension is about what happens to the people who have been offered fantasy in place of truth. The fantasy is not neutral. It produces real decisions based on false information. It generates real investments, emotional, financial, political, in outcomes that the fantasy describes and the reality does not support. And when the fantasy is eventually disrupted by the reality, as it always is, in time, the disenchantment is proportional to the depth of the investment. The person who manufactured the fantasy has, in every case of its eventual disruption, produced harm proportional to how completely they captured their audience's belief. Everyone has a weakness, not a moral weakness, a psychological one. A point of vulnerability that, if engaged, produces a response that bypasses the normal defenses of reason and social performance and touches something more fundamental. Discover each man's thumbscrew. Everyone has a weakness, a gap in the castle wall. That weakness is usually an insecurity, an uncontrollable emotional need. It can also be a small secret pleasure. Either way, once found, a thumbscrew gives you the leverage you need. Greene's framework for finding the thumbscrew identifies several categories. The person whose self-image is invested in a specific quality, their intelligence, their status, their physical appearance, is vulnerable to anything that threatens that quality. The person with a secret vice or passion, something they indulge privately that would be damaging to disclose, is vulnerable to the knowledge. The person with a specific fear or anxiety, often one connected to early experience, is vulnerable to the activation of that fear. The person who craves recognition for something they feel has been insufficiently acknowledged is vulnerable to the offer of that recognition. The historical example is Cardinal Richelieu again, who was famous for maintaining detailed files on the psychological profiles of every person whose cooperation he needed, their specific vulnerabilities, their particular desires, the precise emotional register at which they could be most reliably engaged. His negotiations were not negotiations in the conventional sense. They were the deployment of specifically tailored psychological leverage against targets whose thumbscrews he had already located. The mechanism is the fundamental human reality that we are not uniformly rational across all domains. We are rational in some domains, and specifically, predictably irrational in others. The domains where we are irrational are the domains organized around our deepest needs and fears, the places where the attachment to the outcome is so strong that the normal evaluative machinery is suspended. And those are the domains that the thumbscrew operates in. The moral dimension is the ethics of targeting people's specific psychological vulnerabilities as leverage. The thumbscrew is power over the person at their weakest point. Not their weakest in the sense of their least impressive, but their weakest in the sense of least offend, the most human, the most specifically, irreducibly, privately them. And the person who uses that point as leverage has done something that goes beyond ordinary manipulation. They have entered the part of the person that was not on offer. Before the world decides how to treat you, you have already decided. The way you carry yourself, the quality of attention you pay to your own presentation, the level of respect you demand by the standards of your own behavior, the implicit signal you send with every interaction about what kind of treatment you consider appropriate. These communicate something to everyone who encounters you that precedes any of the specific things you say or do. Be royal in your own fashion. Act like a king to be treated like one. The way you carry yourself will often determine how you are treated. In the long run, appearing vulgar or common will make people disrespect you, for a king respects himself and inspires the same sentiment in others. By acting regally and confident of your powers, you make yourself seem destined to wear a crown. The historical example is Christopher Columbus, who arrived at the courts of various monarchs as a man of modest origin and limited credentials, and managed to secure the backing of Isabella and Ferdinand, partly through the specific quality of his presentation, the confidence of a man who had already decided that his enterprise was significant and his backers were making the right choice. The confidence was not the result of the backing. The backing was partly the result of the confidence. The mechanism is the social signal that self-presentation sends, and the way that signal is processed by the people receiving it. Social status is not directly observable. We infer it from signals, from the quality of clothing, the calibration of behavior to context, the specific kind of attention a person pays or fails to pay to their own presentation. The person who presents themselves as though they expect respect trains the people around them to provide it. The person who presents themselves apologetically trains the people around them to confirm the apology. The moral dimension here is less about manipulation than about the psychology of self-regard and its relationship to how others regard you. The law is, in its deeper reading, an argument for the radical importance of the standards you hold for yourself, not for others, not for the performance of superiority, but as the genuine basis of the respect you extend to your own presence in the world. Time is not neutral. The same action, the same idea, the same request deployed at different moments produces entirely different results, not because the action, idea, or request has changed, but because the context has changed around it. Master the art of timing. Never seem to be in a hurry. Hurrying betrays a lack of control over yourself and over time. Always seem patient, as if you know that everything will come to you eventually. Become a detective of the right moment. Sniff out the spirit of the times, the trends that will carry you to power. Strike only when the moment is most propitious. The historical example is Joseph Fouché, the French revolutionary and Napoleonic official who survived 5 decades of the most volatile political environment in European history, serving Robespierre, surviving the Terror, serving the Directory, serving Napoleon, serving the Bourbons, by cultivating an extraordinary sensitivity to the moment's political weather. He could sense when a political tide was turning before it had turned visibly, and he positioned himself accordingly, always slightly ahead of the shift, never committed so completely to the current regime that the next regime could not use him. The mechanism is the relationship between timing and the specific state of the environment that determines how any action will be received. Every action lands in a context. The context shapes the reception. The same speech that inspires at one moment provokes at another. The same business proposal that is funded in one climate is rejected in another. The same political move that succeeds when the public mood is X fails when the public mood has shifted to Y. The person who understands this, who reads the environment's state before acting rather than acting and expecting the environment to accommodate, has access to a different kind of leverage than the person who acts on their own internal timeline, regardless of external conditions. The moral dimension is minimal here. This is strategic wisdom about the relationship between action and context. The advice to master timing is the advice to be aware of the world you are acting in, to read it carefully, to understand its current state, to wait for the moment when your action will land in the conditions that allow it to produce the results you intend. There is a specific kind of suffering that comes not from the absence of something you want, but from the attention you pay to the absence. The thing itself is not the problem. The relationship your mind maintains with the thing, the constant measurement of the distance between you and it, the continuous evaluation of what its absence means about your status and your worth, that is the problem. Disdain things you cannot have. Ignoring them is the best revenge. By acknowledging a petty problem, you give it existence and credibility. The more attention you pay an enemy, the stronger you make him. And a small mistake is often made worse and more visible when you try to fix it. If there is something you want but cannot have, show contempt for it. The less interest you reveal, the more superior you seem. The historical example is the fox and the grapes from Aesop. The story so ancient and so precisely true to the psychological mechanism that Greene uses it as his primary reference. The fox cannot reach the grapes. The fox declares the grapes sour. The declaration is, on its surface, a lie. The fox does not actually believe the grapes are sour. They are responding to the discomfort of frustrated desire by manufacturing a justification for not wanting what they cannot have. But Greene's reading of this story is not the conventional one. The conventional moral being that the fox is engaged in self-deception, and self-deception is ignoble. Greene's reading is that the fox has, perhaps inadvertently, discovered the correct psychological response to unachievable desire. Not because the grapes are actually sour, because the attention paid to their sweetness is itself the poison. The fox that spends its life straining upward toward unreachable grapes, measuring its failure by the distance between paw and fruit, consumed by the frustration of a desire that cannot be satisfied. That fox is worse off than the fox that declares the grapes sour and moves on, regardless of whether the declaration is technically accurate. The mechanism is the psychology of desire and attention. We suffer not from the things we don't have, but from the attention we allocate to not having them. The desire that consumes attention, that becomes the organizing obsession of a life measured daily, never satisfied, is not the desire for the thing. It is the attachment to the idea of having the thing, and the attachment is entirely internal. It is maintained by the attention, and the attention can be withdrawn. The withdrawal of attention, the deliberate decision to disdain, to look away, to declare the inaccessible thing unworthy of continued desire, is a genuine power move in the relationship between the self and its frustrated desires, not because it changes the external fact of the thing's inaccessibility, because it changes the internal fact of how much you are suffering from that inaccessibility. The moral dimension here is almost entirely inward. This law is not about manipulating others. It is about managing your own psychological relationship to things you cannot have, and its wisdom is genuine. The person who can genuinely turn away from frustrated desire, not with suppression, not with resentment, but with actual redirection of attention, is freer than the person who cannot. They have recovered the cognitive resources that the frustrated desire was consuming. They have denied the inaccessible thing the power it has over them through their own wanting. They have chosen in the most fundamental sense what to want, rather than allowing their wanting to be determined by the accident of what is and isn't available. The philosophical tradition has another name for this capacity. The Stoics called it amor fati, the love of what is, as opposed to the endless war against what isn't. Marcus Aurelius practiced it. Epictetus taught it. The insight is pre-Greene by 2,000 years. The formulation in terms of power of the disdain for inaccessible things as a strategic posture is Greene's contribution, and it is useful because it captures something that purely philosophical framing sometimes misses. The person who genuinely does not want what they cannot have is not just internally at peace. They are externally more powerful than the person who clearly, visibly aches for what they lack. Because desire is legible, and legible desire is leverage for whoever holds the desired thing. The person who appears not to want what you have cannot be controlled by the threat of withholding it. This is true in the negotiation, in the relationship, in the political contest. The wanting is the vulnerability. The disdain, genuine, not performed, eliminates it. Now the nuance. The advice to disdain what you cannot have is useful for things that are genuinely inaccessible, things that no realistic effort can achieve, things whose pursuit is genuinely futile. It becomes dangerous as a general philosophy of desire management because it can be applied to things that are difficult but achievable, things that require sustained effort and tolerance of frustration to reach. The person who disdains everything difficult enough to produce frustration is not liberated. They are simply not growing. The productive frustration, the frustration of the worthwhile challenge, is not the same as the consuming frustration of the impossible desire. Distinguishing between them is the work that the law leaves to the reader. Before words, before arguments, before the careful presentation of evidence and the patient construction of logical cases, there is the image, the visual, the spectacle, the thing that hits the eye and the gut before the mind has a chance to evaluate it. Create compelling spectacles. Striking imagery and grand symbolic gestures create the aura of power. Everyone responds to them. Stage spectacles for those around you then, full of arresting visuals and radiant symbols that heighten your presence. Dazzled by appearances, no one will notice what you are really doing. The historical example is the coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804, the ceremony that Napoleon stage managed with the obsessive attention to detail of a director who understood that the spectacle was not the decoration of his power, but the instantiation of it, the painting by David. The Pope's presence, carefully calibrated to suggest religious endorsement without religious subordination. The crown that Napoleon took from the Pope's hands and placed on his own head, communicating in a single wordless gesture visible to the entire assembled court that his authority derived from himself rather than from the church that had previously claimed authority over all crowned heads of Europe. The message was not stated, it was shown. And showing is more powerful than stating because it bypasses the evaluative apparatus that evaluates statements and goes directly to the more ancient, more immediate system that processes visual images. You see the crown being placed, you feel the meaning before you have formed a thought about it. And the feeling established before the thought shapes everything the thought does afterward. The mechanism is the sensory pathway that visual information takes through the brain relative to propositional information. Visual information is processed faster, retained longer, and recalled more readily than text or speech. It engages more systems simultaneously, aesthetic, emotional, spatial, and produces a more complete and immersive experience of meaning than any description of the same information can achieve. The person who communicates in images has access to all of these advantages over the person who communicates only in propositions. The moral dimension of this law is about the relationship between image and reality and what happens when the spectacle becomes a substitute for the substance it is supposed to represent. Napoleon's coronation was a spectacle of genuine power. He was genuinely powerful. The ceremony represented something real. The spectacle that represents something genuine is not deception. It is communication in the most effective available register. The spectacle that is constructed specifically to compensate for the absence of the substance it appears to represent, the elaborate ceremony performed by a leader who has nothing, is different in moral kind. It is the substitution of image for reality, at the expense of the people who are taking the image at face value. And its costs extend beyond the specific deception of specific people. A political culture organized around the management of spectacle, where image consistently substitutes for substance, produces a specific kind of public epistemology, one where the spectacle is expected to be separate from the reality, where the management of appearance is accepted as the primary activity of power, where genuine accountability becomes impossible because the surfaces are so consistently managed that the reality beneath them is inaccessible. The history of independent thought is largely a history of people who said, at exactly the wrong moment, something the crowd was not ready to hear, and paid for it. Think as you like, but behave like others. If you make a show of going against the times, flaunting your unconventional ideas and unorthodox ways, people will think that you only want attention and that you look down upon them. They will find a way to punish you for making them feel inferior. It is far safer to blend in and nurture the common touch. Share your original ideas with tolerant friends and those who are sure to appreciate your uniqueness. Never be different from the people around you in ways that make them feel condemned. The historical example is Tommaso Campanella, the Renaissance philosopher who spent 27 years in prison for the crime of holding and expressing heterodox views. His ideas were, by any measure, remarkable. His City of the Sun was a visionary utopian work that influenced European thought for centuries. He paid for the expression of those ideas with most of his adult life in a cell. Galileo Galilei more famously survived his encounter with the Inquisition by making a sufficient public show of recantation. Whatever he actually believed, he behaved, publicly, like someone who accepted the Church's position. Whether this was wisdom or cowardice has been debated for 4 centuries. Greene's reading is unambiguous. It was survival. And survival preserved Galileo's capacity to continue doing the work that mattered, privately, regardless of the public performance. The mechanism is the social immune system, the set of mechanisms by which groups maintain their coherence by identifying and managing members who deviate from the group's norms. Deviation from group norms activates the immune response. The response is not proportional to the actual threat the deviation poses. It is proportional to the visibility of the deviation and the degree to which the deviation implies criticism of those who conform. The person who is visibly, conspicuously different from the norm does not merely fail to conform. They implicitly criticize every person in the group who does conform. And the social immune response to implicit criticism of that kind is powerful, persistent, and does not require the critic to have intended any criticism. The visible deviation is the offense. The intent is irrelevant. The moral dimension is about integrity and its relationship to social survival. The law advises a form of strategic conformity, maintaining private thought while performing public compliance, that is psychologically costly, and that requires a consistent, sustained separation between the inner life and its external expression. The person who practices this law over a lifetime develops a specific capacity for compartmentalization that is both an asset and a cost. An asset because it allows them to maintain their actual views while surviving environments that would punish those views. A cost because the compartmentalization that protects the inner life from the social world also over time makes the inner life increasingly inaccessible to genuine relationship with others. The wisest use of this law is probably the one Greene implies: selective conformity. Not universal performance of compliance, which produces the most extreme form of the compartmentalization cost, but the intelligent discrimination between situations where visibility of difference is worth the risk and situations where it is not, between environments that are genuinely tolerant of heterodoxy and environments that are not, between times when the expression of unconventional views serves genuine purpose and times when it serves only the ego of the person doing the expressing. Anger is useful, other people's anger specifically. The person who can provoke and control the anger of opponents has an extraordinary strategic advantage over the person who cannot. Stir up waters to catch fish. Anger and emotion are strategically counterproductive. You must always stay calm and objective. But if you can make your enemies angry while you remain calm, you gain a decided advantage. Put your enemies off balance. Find the chink in their vanity through which you can rattle them and you hold the strings. The historical example is Napoleon Bonaparte again, here in the role of the strategist who made the deliberate provocation of opponents' emotional states part of his military and political strategy. Napoleon understood that an angry general makes worse decisions than a calm one. The angry general acts too quickly, commits to engagements before they are properly prepared, exposes flanks in the urgency of attack, and generally produces in his own actions exactly the kinds of errors that the patient, calm opponent can exploit. So Napoleon provoked deliberate insults in diplomatic correspondence, movements designed to threaten what the opponent held most dear, actions calibrated not only for their direct military effect, but for their effect on the emotional state of the opposing commander. The military campaign and the psychological operation were conducted simultaneously. The mechanism is the relationship between emotional arousal and the quality of decision-making. This relationship is not linear. Moderate emotional arousal actually improves decision-making in some contexts by increasing focus and motivation. But high emotional arousal, specifically anger, has consistent and well-documented effects on decision quality. It narrows attention, reduces consideration of alternatives, shortens time horizons, and increases risk-taking in ways that benefit whoever is not angry at the expense of whoever is. The angry person is not less intelligent. They are intelligent under a set of constraints, attentional, temporal, risk-evaluative, that systematically degrade the quality of the intelligence's outputs. And the person who can reliably produce those constraints in their opponent, while maintaining the absence of those constraints in themselves, has a genuine and specific advantage that no amount of raw intelligence can fully compensate for. The moral dimension is the ethics of deliberate emotional manipulation. The person who stirs up waters to catch fish has made their opponent's psychological state into a tool, has used the specific vulnerabilities of the anger response as a mechanism for achieving their own goals at the opponent's expense. This is not a neutral or innocent strategy. It is the deliberate activation of a psychological vulnerability for strategic advantage, and yet the corrective that the law implies, the cultivation of emotional regulation, of the capacity to remain calm when others are trying to provoke, of the ability to observe rather than react, is genuinely valuable quite independently of any strategic application. The person who can maintain equanimity in the face of provocation is not only harder to manipulate, they are better at thinking. They are better at relationship. They are, in some important sense, freer than the person who cannot. The thing that costs nothing is worth nothing, and the thing that costs nothing is also, specifically and additionally, not free, because the person who offers it is extracting something that is not visible in the offer's terms. Despise the free lunch. What is offered for free is dangerous. It usually involves either a trick or a hidden obligation. What is worth paying for. By paying your own way, you stay clear of gratitude, guilt, and deceit. It is also often wise to pay the full price. There is no cutting corners with excellence. Be lavish with your money and keep it circulating, for generosity is a sign and magnet of power. The historical example is Juan Perón and his wife Eva, who understood that strategic generosity, giving to the poor in ways that were visible, lavish, and specifically not free in the sense of expecting nothing in return, was the most effective form of political power building in a society with deep inequalities. The gift bound the recipient. The visible generosity created political loyalty. The relationship between Evita and the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the Argentine working class, was genuine in its emotional content and profoundly strategic in its function. The love was real. The love was also a power structure. The mechanism is the reciprocation tendency that Munger also identified, the deep, evolutionarily ancient drive to return what has been given. The free gift is not free. It is a down payment on an obligation that the recipient will feel, consciously or not, until they have discharged it. The person who offers free things understands this. The person who accepts free things without understanding it is navigating a transaction they have not consented to because they have not understood it. The law's advice to despise the free lunch is, at its core, the advice to understand the economy of obligation that all social exchange operates within. There are no free gifts, only deferred payments. The payment is sometimes worth making, the gift is sometimes genuinely worth the obligation it creates. But the person who accepts without understanding what they are accepting is not exercising choice, they are being managed. The moral dimension is about generosity and its relationship to power. The law does not condemn generosity. Greene is quite explicit that lavish, genuine generosity is itself a form of power. What it condemns is the strategic use of apparent generosity to create obligations that are not transparent to the recipient. The person who gives in order to bind is not being generous. They are investing. And the investment carries terms that the supposed recipient has not agreed to because they have not been told what the terms are. The successor's position is, structurally, one of the most difficult positions in any institution. The great predecessor has shaped the environment in their own image. Every standard is calibrated to their performance. Every comparison unfavorable. And the successor who attempts to succeed by continuing the predecessor's approach discovers that they are always the copy, always inferior to the original, always being measured against a standard they did not set and cannot surpass because the standard was defined by someone who no longer has to sustain it. Avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. What happens first always appears better and more original than what comes after. If you succeed a great man or have a famous parent, you will have to accomplish double their achievements to outshine them. Do not get lost in their shadow or stuck in a past not of your making. Establish your own name and identity by changing course. The historical example is Alexander the Great's successors, the Diadochi, the generals who divided his empire after his death and who spent their careers in the shadow of an achievement that could not be matched, that could only be maintained imperfectly, that made everything they did seem lesser because the comparison was always available. The mechanism is the reference point problem. Every performance is evaluated against a reference point. When the reference point is a great predecessor, the successor's performance is always measured against the best, and the best, having been achieved under conditions that no longer exist, is a standard that the present circumstances cannot replicate. The successor who accepts the predecessor's frame has accepted the comparison, and the comparison is structured to find them wanting. The correct response is to change the frame, to establish a new reference point, a new standard, a new direction that cannot be compared to the predecessor because it is doing something different. Not better than the predecessor in the predecessor's terms, different in terms the predecessor never set. The moral dimension is minimal here. This is strategic wisdom about the management of identity in institutional contexts. The insight is real and practically important. The person who defines themselves primarily by their relationship to a great predecessor, whether the predecessor is a parent, a mentor, a great leader, or a great previous iteration of themselves, has built their identity on a comparison that is structured to diminish them. The work of establishing an independent identity is not disloyalty to the predecessor. It is the necessary assertion of the present person's independent worth. Every collective has a center, not always a formal leader, sometimes an informal one, the person whose energy organizes the group, whose confidence is the source of the group's confidence, whose relationships hold the network together. Remove the center and the collective dissolves, not because the other members are unimportant, because the center was providing the organizing function that held them in relation to each other. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Trouble can often be traced to a single strong individual, the stirrer, the arrogant underling, the poisoner of goodwill. If you allow such people to stick around, others will succumb to their influence. Do not wait for the troubles they cause to multiply. Do not try to negotiate with them. They are irreformable. Neutralize their influence by isolating or banishing them. The historical example is Athenian democracy's use of ostracism, the formal mechanism by which any citizen could be voted out of Athens for a period of 10 years without crime or trial, simply by the collective judgment of the assembly that they had become too powerful, too dangerous, or too disruptive to the city's functioning. The mechanism was not about punishment. It was about the targeted removal of individuals whose presence was creating dynamics that the collective wanted to eliminate. The mechanism is the network effect of individual influence. Individuals who serve as hubs, whose relationships connect many others, whose energy organizes group dynamics, have disproportionate influence over collective behavior. Their removal does not simply reduce the collective by one person. It removes the organizing node, and the connections that were organized through that node collapse. The followers, without their organizing center, do not immediately find a new one. They scatter, become disoriented, lose the specific energy that the center was providing. The moral dimension is about the relationship between protecting the collective and the rights of the individual who is removed. Ostracism, as the historical mechanism, is revealing in this regard. It required no crime, no due process, no specific offense. It required only the collective's decision that a person had become problematic. This is a power that can be exercised for genuine collective good. It is also a power that can be exercised to eliminate anyone who challenges the existing order, regardless of whether the challenge is legitimate or the existing order is worth preserving. The specific application to organizational contexts is important. The advice to strike the shepherd, rather than negotiating with troublemakers, is, in the best case, advice to identify and address the source of dysfunction rather than its symptoms. In the worst case, it is advice to eliminate dissent by removing the person who is most effectively making it. Force achieves compliance. Genuine influence achieves something different and something more durable. Voluntary cooperation rooted in genuine emotional alignment. The person who rules through fear rules only as long as the fear persists. The person who rules through genuine affection and belief rules as long as the affection and belief hold, which, if cultivated properly, is far longer and requires far less ongoing maintenance. Work on the hearts and minds of others. Coercion creates a reaction that will eventually work against you. You must seduce others into wanting to move in your direction. A person you have seduced becomes your ally, and an ally is better than a minion or a slave. The way to seduce others is to operate on their individual psychologies and weaknesses. Soften up the resistant by working on their emotions, playing on what they hold dear and what they fear. The historical example is Marie de Medici and her handling of the French court, the specific, sustained, patient work of understanding the emotional needs of each key figure in the court, and providing in each case the specific thing that each figure most needed to feel genuinely aligned rather than merely compliant. Not the same thing to each person, the specific thing each person needed. Information about their individual psychology converted into individually calibrated management of their emotional experience of the court. The mechanism is the specific difference between transactional and relational influence. Transactional influence, I will do this for you if you do this for me, is powerful in the short term and limited in scope. It produces the desired behavior only as long as the exchange is ongoing and only in the specific domains the exchange covers. Relational influence, I have cultivated your genuine emotional alignment with my goals, produces behavior that goes beyond any specific transaction, that is self-motivated rather than exchange-motivated, and that persists without active maintenance because the alignment has become internal to the influenced person. The moral dimension is about the ethics of the emotional manipulation required to produce genuine alignment when genuine alignment is being cultivated instrumentally. The leader who genuinely cultivates the emotional well-being of the people who follow them, who genuinely responds to their individual needs and psychology, who genuinely builds relationships of real mutual understanding, is not merely practicing Law 43, they may be practicing genuine leadership which happens to produce the outcomes that Law 43 describes. The leader who does all of the same things purely as an influence strategy, who performs the emotional understanding, who manufactures the apparent response to needs, who cultivates the appearance of genuine relationship while maintaining the reality of strategic relationship management, is practicing Law 43 in its most manipulative form. And the distance between these two is not always visible from outside, which is exactly why the law is in the book. The mirror is the ultimate strategic weapon, not a physical mirror, the psychological one. The exact replication of another person's behavior, values, and style back at them, with the specific effect that they cannot criticize what you are doing without criticizing what they themselves do. Disarm and infuriate with the mirror effect. The mirror reflects reality, but it is also the perfect tool for deception. When you mirror your enemies, doing exactly as they do, they cannot figure out your strategy. The mirror effect mocks and humiliates them, making them overreact. The historical example is the diplomat Alcibiades, the brilliant and immoral Athenian general who survived in the courts of Athens, Sparta, and Persia by becoming in each context exactly what that context valued. In Athens, the dashing democrat. In Sparta, the austere warrior. In Persia, the sophisticated courtier. The mirror that reflects back exactly what each audience wants to see is simultaneously the ultimate performance of adaptability and the ultimate protection from attack, because how do you condemn someone for reflecting your own values back at you? The mechanism is the specific vulnerability that mirroring activates in anyone who attempts to criticize the mirror. The mirror presents no clear target. The criticism of the mirroring person's behavior is the criticism of your own behavior. The moral attack on their conduct is the moral attack on yours. The mirror disarms by removing the standard of criticism. Because any standard you apply to them applies equally to you, the moral dimension is about authenticity and what the perfect mirror costs the person who becomes it. The mirror that reflects everyone back at themselves has, in the limit, no face of its own. Alcibiades was famously described as having no consistent character, as being whatever he needed to be in whatever context he found himself. This was strategically brilliant and personally hollow. The person who is everything to everyone is, in the most fundamental sense, nothing to themselves. The identity that is constituted entirely by strategic adaptation to audience has no independent existence. It is a collection of mirrors. There is no one behind them. Change is necessary, change is also threatening. And the specific art of managing large-scale change, in institutions, in cultures, in organizations, requires understanding both of these things simultaneously and calibrating the pace of change to the tolerance of the people who must live through it. Preach the need for change, but never reform too much at once. Everyone understands the need for change in the abstract, but on the day-to-day level, people are creatures of habit. Too much innovation is traumatic and will lead to revolt. If you are new to a position of power or an outsider trying to make inroads into a new culture, adapt to the customs around you. Promote change gradually and frame it as a gentle improvement on the past. The historical example is Mao Zedong, who understood that the Cultural Revolution, which was, by any standard, a catastrophically radical rupture from everything that Chinese culture had been, had to be framed not as a break with the past, but as a return to a more authentic Chinese past that had been corrupted by foreign influence and domestic reaction. The revolution was packaged as restoration. The radical change was sold as conservative recovery. The mechanism is the human need for continuity of identity, the psychological requirement that change, however significant, be connectable to the story of what came before. People can accept substantial changes to their circumstances if those changes can be integrated into a continuous narrative. They resist changes that require the abandonment of the narrative entirely, that require them to become in some fundamental sense different people. The art of managing change is the art of making the new continuous with the old even when it isn't. The moral dimension is about the ethics of the packaging. If the change is genuinely good, if the reform that is being implemented gradually and framed carefully is a reform that serves the people being asked to accept it, then the careful management of its presentation is not deception. It is wisdom about how human beings process change. If the change is destructive, if the reform being implemented under the cover of gradual framing is actually a power grab being sold as common good, then the packaging is a form of fraud, and the distinction matters enormously. The person who is too impressive generates envy, and envy, as Munger observed and Greene elaborates, is one of the most dangerous forces in any social environment because it is not visible in its early stages and is almost impossible to reason out of the person who feels it. Never appear too perfect. Appearing better than others is always dangerous, but most dangerous of all is to appear to have no faults or weaknesses. Envy creates silent enemies. It is smart to occasionally display defects and to admit to harmless vices in order to deflect the envy and hostility of others. Make yourself one of them. The historical example is the French diplomat Talleyrand, one of the greatest political survivors in European history, who served every regime from the monarchy through the Revolution, through Napoleon, through the Restoration, who cultivated a reputation for mild, harmless, slightly comic vices and vanities that made him seem less threatening than his actual abilities warranted. His apparent vices, his laziness, his social frivolity, his famous love of comfort, were real enough, but were also, in Talleyrand's management of his image, useful precisely because they humanized him. They made the people around him feel that they had found his weakness. And a person whose weakness you think you have found is a person you do not need to destroy. The mechanism is the specific discomfort that perfection generates in those who witness it. The person without apparent weakness offers nothing to the evaluating gaze except the gap between their perfection and the observer's imperfection. And that gap activates a specific form of the competitive psychology that social comparison produces in most human minds. The gap between admiration and envy is very small, and whether a person falls on one side or the other is determined partly by how achievable the envied quality seems. The perfect person seems to have achieved something impossible. Impossible achievements do not inspire, they discourage, and discouragement in the right conditions converts to hostility. The displayed flaw, the cultivated imperfection, the harmless vice, the small failure that is allowed to be visible, is an invitation. It says, there is a gap between this person and perfection. The gap is fillable, the achievement is mortal, and mortal achievement can be admired rather than envied because it is, in principle, available to the admirer. The moral dimension is about the relationship between strategic vulnerability and genuine vulnerability, between the flaw that is shown because showing it serves your purposes and the flaw that is visible because it is real and you are not performing otherwise. The genuine vulnerability, the actual imperfection acknowledged honestly, builds a different kind of relationship than the strategic display of managed flaws, but both are better, in terms of the envy they generate, than the performance of seamless perfection. Victory has a specific danger that defeat does not. Defeat announces its costs immediately. Victory conceals them. The person who has achieved what they set out to achieve experiences a specific form of cognitive distortion, the momentum of success, the elevated confidence of the victorious state, the difficulty of believing that the upward trajectory has reached its peak, that consistently produces the overextension that converts victory into the conditions for subsequent defeat. Do not go past the mark you aimed for. In victory, learn when to stop. The moment of victory is often the moment of greatest peril. In the heat of victory, arrogance and overconfidence can push you past the goal you had aimed for, and by going too far, you make more enemies than you defeat. Do not allow success to go to your head. There is no substitute for strategy and careful planning. Set a goal, and when you reach it, stop. The historical example is Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the most famous case in military history of the victor who could not stop. Napoleon had achieved strategic dominance over Europe. The invasion of Russia was not strategically necessary by any assessment that was not distorted by the momentum of previous success and the specific psychological state of the undefeated general. The goal had been achieved. Europe was under French hegemony. The going past the goal, the attempt to make the hegemony absolute by breaking the one remaining power that had not submitted, produced the catastrophe that ended the hegemony entirely. The mechanism is the momentum trap. Successive successes create a psychological state in which the next success seems achievable by the same means that produced the previous ones. The confidence is legitimate. It is based on evidence. But the evidence is from the past, and the conditions of the past are not the conditions of the present. The momentum that carried you to the goal does not necessarily carry past it. Often the conditions on the other side of the goal are exactly the conditions that the goal's achievement created, conditions that are different from the ones that made the achievement possible. The moral dimension is minimal here. This is again more wisdom than manipulation. The advice to learn when to stop is the advice that the capacity for restraint is itself a form of power. The person who can choose not to push beyond what is needed, who can leave opponents with face-saving escapes, who can secure a position without eliminating the human beings in it, who can achieve goals without converting the achievement into the overreach that generates the next round of opposition, is demonstrating a sophistication that the person drunk on victory's momentum cannot access. We arrive at the final law, and the final law is, in some ways, the most philosophically sophisticated, the one that encompasses all the others, that describes not a specific tactic but a fundamental orientation, an orientation toward power that transcends any specific form it takes. Assume formlessness. By taking a shape, by having a visible plan, you open yourself to attack. Instead, be like water, formless and adaptable. Accept the fact that nothing is certain and no law is fixed. The best way to protect yourself is to be as fluid and formless as water. Never bet on stability or lasting order. Everything changes. Greene's reference is the ancient Chinese concept of Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of action through non-action, of influence through formlessness, of power exercised by not opposing rather than by opposing. The water that flows around the rock does not fight the rock. It is formless enough to find the path that the rock creates, patient enough to persist in that path, and, over sufficient time, powerful enough to wear the rock down, while the rock remains exactly as hard as it was. The historical example is the tactics of guerrilla warfare, specifically the Viet Cong's strategy against the American military in Vietnam, which was the strategy of an apparently formless opponent against a highly structured one. The American military was optimized to fight another army, a force with identifiable positions, supply lines, command structures, and a form that could be targeted and destroyed. Against an opponent that had no fixed positions, that merged with the civilian population, that had no supply lines that could be interdicted, that had no command structure that could be decapitated, the American military's power was largely irrelevant. The form it was designed to destroy did not exist. The mechanism is the specific vulnerability of form to attack. Everything that has a definite shape can be targeted at its edges. Everything that commits to a position can be attacked at that position. Everything that has a structure can be undermined at the weakest point of that structure. The formless opponent presents no edges, no committed positions, no structural weaknesses. It is not that they are stronger than the structured opponent, it is that the structured opponent's strength is not applicable to them. The moral dimension of the final law is the most philosophically interesting of all 48. Because formlessness, in the deepest sense, is not just a strategic orientation. It is a relationship to identity itself. The person who assumes formlessness in the fullest sense is the person who does not commit to any fixed view of themselves, who does not defend an ego boundary, who remains genuinely open to change, not strategically, not as performance, but actually in the way that water is actually formless, who does not fight for a self-image because they hold no self-image so fixed that losing it would constitute a loss. This is not emptiness. The Taoist tradition that Greene is drawing on is very clear about this. The formless person is not the person who has nothing. They are the person who holds their having lightly, who is responsive to the actual conditions of the actual moment rather than to the theoretical conditions of the preferred self-image, who meets what is with what is needed rather than with what they have decided in advance they will bring. In this reading, the 48th law arrives at something that the first 47 were approaching from other angles. The deepest power is not the power of force or cunning, or the specific tactical mastery of any of the preceding laws. The deepest power is the power of non-attachment, the power of the person who is genuinely, not strategically responsive to what is, who has no fixed form that can be attacked because there is genuinely no fixed form to attack. This is the law that is most easily misunderstood as nihilism. It is, if read carefully, the opposite of nihilism. It is the highest form of engagement with reality, the engagement that brings no predetermined agenda, that imposes no fixed frame, that is genuinely available to what the moment requires rather than to what the strategy has pre-specified. The 48th law is the one that, if fully inhabited, makes all the other 47 unnecessary. We have now traced all 48 laws. We have seen their mechanisms. We have noted their moral dimensions. We have traced the historical examples that Greene uses to ground them in the specific, embodied, irreversible texture of real consequences for real people. Now we need to look at what the consistent application of these laws does, not to the people they are applied to, but to the person who applies them. Because this is the story that the book does not tell, and that history consistently does tell, and that the gap between the two is one of the most important things to understand about the pursuit of power. The person who consistently applies the 48 laws is a person whose relationship to other people has been restructured by the strategic frame. Every interaction is evaluated for its power implications. Every relationship is assessed for its utility. Every person who enters the field of attention is categorized, ally, threat, tool, obstacle, before they have been encountered as a human being, and the categorization, once made, shapes all subsequent interaction in ways that prevent the encounter from becoming anything the category did not pre-specify. This restructuring is not trivial or trivial. It is the replacement of genuine encounter with strategic processing, and it has a specific consequence that all the 48 laws together cannot prevent: the progressive isolation of the person who practices them from the specific human experiences of genuine surprise, genuine trust, genuine intimacy, genuine being known that the laws systematically prevent. The military strategist who has applied Law 2 consistently, who has never trusted friends, who has always used enemies, has no friends. Not in the functional sense. They have allies whose reliability has been confirmed by self-interest alignment, and they have managed adversaries, and they have a network of relationships calibrated to strategic utility. What they do not have is anyone who knows them and chooses to remain with them, regardless of what that relationship requires strategically. Anyone who would absorb the cost of the relationship without calculating the return. Anyone who would tell them the truth rather than what the strategic frame of the relationship makes it safe to say. The person who has applied Law 11 consistently, who has always kept others dependent, who has never taught enough to allow others to do without them, has manufactured a specific kind of loneliness. They are surrounded by people who need them, not people who choose them. The need and the choice look the same from the outside. They do not feel the same from the inside. And the person at the center of the dependency network knows the difference, even if they have spent decades refusing to acknowledge it. The person who has applied Law 27 consistently, who has played on people's need to believe, who has built the cult-like following, has created the most complete form of the power isolation paradox. They are at the center of everything. They are touched by nothing real, because the people who surround them are there in response to the manufactured belief, not in response to the actual person. The actual person, the one behind the performance of the belief system, is more thoroughly alone in the crowd of believers than they would be in genuine solitude. These are not hypothetical costs. They are the consistent features of the historical record that Greene himself draws from. The rulers he cites, the strategists he describes, the power masters he documents, they are, in their inner lives as recorded, among the most isolated people in the histories they shaped. Not because power is inherently corrupting in the moralistic sense, but because the consistent application of the laws produces, as a structural byproduct, the progressive elimination of the conditions under which genuine human connection is possible. And genuine human connection, the direct, unmediated, no-agenda encounter with another person as they actually are, is not a luxury. It is, for most human beings, one of the primary sources of the sense of meaning and aliveness that makes the accumulation of power feel worthwhile in the first place. The person who has accumulated power at the cost of genuine connection has traded the thing that made the accumulation seem worthwhile for the accumulation itself. They have arrived at the destination and found the destination empty, and the laws that brought them there cannot produce the thing they were seeking when they began. The 48 laws look different from the other side. From the inside, from the position of the person who is applying them, they look like strategy, like the intelligent navigation of a world that operates by certain rules, like the exercise of the agency that intelligence and understanding provide over circumstances that would otherwise be chaotic or arbitrary. From the outside, from the position of the person they are being applied to, they look like something else. They look like betrayal, like manipulation, like the specific disorienting experience of discovering that the situation you were navigating was not the situation you thought you were navigating, that the rules you were playing by were not the rules the game was being played by, that the person you were relating to was not relating to you in the way you thought they were relating to you. This experience, the discovery that you have been managed, that the relationship you were in was operating at a level of strategic calculation that you were not aware of, has a specific psychological signature. It is the signature of violated trust. And violated trust, in its psychological effects, is not merely the loss of confidence in a specific person. It is the revision of a model of the social world. It is the discovery that the world you thought you were living in was not the world you were living in. This revision is painful. It is also, in many cases, permanently altering. The person who has been the recipient of systematic power management, who has been the target of several of the 48 laws applied with real skill, comes out of the experience with a revised model of human social behavior. A more defended model. A model in which the detection of strategic manipulation is higher priority than the extension of trust. A model in which every expression of apparent care or generosity is evaluated for its strategic function before it is received as genuine. This revision is understandable. It is also costly to the person who makes it, because the defensive model that protects against manipulation also prevents the genuine connection that the defensive model was built in response to losing. And it is costly to everyone who subsequently encounters the person with the revised model, because they are being responded to with the suspicion generated by someone else's behavior. This is one of the ways that the power game propagates. The person who was victimized by the game learns its mechanics and begins to apply them. The application victimizes others. The victimized others learn the mechanics. The game expands. The baseline level of strategic behavior in the environment rises. The baseline level of trust falls. And everyone is worse off not in the dramatic, headline-generating way of acute conflict, but in the quieter, more durable way of a social environment that has become less capable of the genuine cooperation and genuine connection that everyone in it is, beneath the strategic persona, still seeking. Understanding the laws from the victim's side is not about cultivating resentment. It is about understanding the social cost of the game, the specific, cumulative, long-term damage that the consistent application of the 48 laws does to the social environments in which they are applied. Not to any specific target, to the texture of social life, to the possibility of trust, to the conditions under which human beings can be genuinely present with each other without the strategic persona between them. The world that the 48 Laws of Power describes is, in its historical examples and its implicit assumptions, largely a world of men competing for power in environments that were designed by and for men. The courts of Renaissance Italy, the palaces of Chinese emperors, the military campaigns of European history, these are settings in which women appear primarily as objects of power strategy rather than as agents of it. This is not Greene's limitation alone. It is the limitation of the historical record he draws from, a record that systematically underdocumented the power strategies of women, partly because women were excluded from the formal power structures that the record documented, and partly because the power strategies available to people excluded from formal structures look different from the 48 laws, and are therefore not recognizable within them. Women's power in the historical context Greene describes was, by necessity, exercised differently, not through the direct application of laws designed for formal hierarchies, through the informal, through the management of relationships, through the cultivation of alliances, through the specific forms of influence available to people who are excluded from official power while remaining essential to the functioning of official structures. Catherine de' Medici, who appears in the book as an agent rather than an object, understood this perfectly. Her power was not the power of the throne, it was the power of the person behind the throne, the power of the indispensable advisor, the irreplaceable relationship manager, the controller of access to the formal power that she could not officially hold. The laws apply to women who inhabit formal power structures. They apply differently and require different calibration to people who are navigating power from positions of structural exclusion. And the specific application of the laws by people in positions of structural exclusion, the colonized, the economically marginalized, the racially excluded, the systematically disempowered, requires an analysis that Greene's book, focused on the strategies of those within power structures rather than those outside them, does not fully prohoon. This is not a reason to dismiss the book. It is a reason to read it as the partial picture it is, a picture of power from the inside of formal structures, drawn from a historical record that privileged those structures. The fuller picture includes the strategies of resistance, of collective action, of the accumulation of power by people who cannot play by the 48 laws, because those laws are the laws of the game that is being played against them. That fuller picture is its own book. This documentary has noted its absence. Let us be direct about something that the neutrality of Greene's presentation makes easy to avoid. The most complete practitioners of the 48 laws in recorded history include some of the most destructive people who ever lived. Joseph Stalin applied Law 2 with absolute consistency, trusting no one, using former enemies and current allies with identical ruthlessness, eliminating anyone who showed signs of independent influence. He applied Law 15 with equal consistency, crushing enemies not merely in body but in the historical record, rewriting the photographic archive, eliminating not just the people but the memory of the people. He applied Law 17, deliberately cultivating the unpredictability that kept the entire Soviet apparatus in a state of permanent exhausted terror. He applied Law 42, striking the shepherd repeatedly, eliminating the organizing nodes of any potential opposition before the opposition could cohere. The result was a state of absolute power sustained for nearly 3 decades, and approximately 20 million deaths by execution, famine, and the specific violence of a system organized entirely around the consolidation of one man's power. Mao Zedong applied Law 50, reforming in ways that framed radical change as cultural restoration. He applied Law 27, building a cult of belief that produced in its followers a surrender of individual judgment that no force could have achieved. He applied Law 43, working on the hearts and minds of an entire civilization, converting the emotional landscape of Chinese identity to align with the goals of his power. The result was a political transformation of extraordinary scope, and approximately 45 million deaths in the Great Leap Forward alone. Adolf Hitler applied Law 37, creating spectacles of such overwhelming scale that the rational evaluation of the ideology they were attached to was suspended in the emotional experience of the spectacle. He applied Law 6, courting attention at all costs, making himself the organizing center of an entire nation's public attention. He applied Law 32, playing to fantasies of national greatness, racial destiny, the restoration of injured dignity, all the specific fantasies that the specific historical moment of post-Weimar Germany had made maximally potent. The result requires no enumeration. The point is not that the laws cause these outcomes. The laws are neutral tools. The point is that the laws, applied without conscience, by people for whom the only question was the strategic one, applied at scale, across entire societies, with the full force of state power behind them, produce these outcomes. That the absence of the moral dimension from the strategic calculation is not a neutral omission. It is the specific condition under which the strategic becomes catastrophic. Greene's book is a description of power mechanics. The mechanics can be used for purposes that range from the personal and relatively benign, the navigation of office politics, the management of a career, to the historically catastrophic. The mechanics themselves do not determine the outcome. The character of the person applying them and the scale at which they are applied determine the outcome. This is why the moral dimension matters, not as an external constraint on the strategic, as the thing that determines whether the strategic is serving human flourishing or destroying it. The courts of the Renaissance are 4 centuries distant. The mechanisms they produced are in the boardroom next door. The corporate raider who applies Law 7, taking credit for the work of the analysts and associates who produced the thesis, while ensuring that the thesis is associated exclusively with their name. The executive who applies Law 11, keeping the people who report to them dependent rather than developing them, to ensure that no one ever becomes capable enough to replace them. The CEO who applies Law 17, maintaining an unpredictability of mood and decision-making that keeps the entire organization in a state of anxious alertness, unable to plan, unable to act without checking the current emotional weather of the top. The specific form of corporate power pathology that the 48 laws most consistently describe is the environment of high-functioning toxic leadership. The leader whose results are good enough to protect them from accountability, whose strategic skills are sophisticated enough to maintain the appearance of legitimate management, but who is using the 48 laws as their actual operating system, rather than the stated values of the organization they lead. These environments produce specific measurable costs. The research on toxic leadership, the empirical study of what happens to organizations when the people at the top are consistently strategic in their relationship to everyone around them, is extensive and consistent. Talented people leave. The people who remain are over time the people who have adapted to the environment, which means, in an environment of strategic management, the people who have become strategic in their own behavior. The organization's culture converges toward the leader's model, and the convergence is accelerating, because the people who survive the selection pressure of the toxic environment are the people most willing to apply its methods to everyone below them. The 48 laws, applied throughout an organizational hierarchy, produce an organization in which no one trusts anyone, in which every relationship is evaluated for its strategic utility before it is entered, in which the official culture and the actual operating culture are maximally divergent, in which enormous cognitive and emotional resources are consumed in the navigation of internal politics as that produces nothing except the navigation itself. These organizations exist. They are recognizable to anyone who has spent time in them, and the mechanics that produce them, the specific applications of the 48 laws that convert a potentially functional organization into a high-functioning dysfunctional one, are exactly the mechanics that this documentary has been describing. Recognizing the mechanics is the first step toward not participating in them. Not because the individual who refuses to play the game is protected by the refusal, they may not be, but because the person who understands what the game costs, to themselves and to everyone around them, is in a position to make a genuine choice about whether to play it, rather than being played by it. They come with visions, with certainty, with the specific authority of someone who has arrived at knowledge that others are still seeking, and they offer, in exchange for a form of trust that gradually becomes a form of surrender, the thing that the specific historical moment has made most scarce. Jim Jones offered community and racial equality in an era of American racial division. Charles Manson offered family and countercultural authenticity in an era of social fracture. L. Ron Hubbard offered certainty and self-improvement in an era of existential drift. And more recently, smaller figures, less publicly visible, operating in the specific ecosystems of online community and digital attention, offering belonging, understanding, the sense of being one of the few who see through the world's illusions in an era of mass loneliness and institutional distrust. They all use the same laws. Law 27, creating the belief system. The specific doctrinal content varies. The structure is identical, a body of knowledge accessible through the leader, exclusive to the community, marking members as distinct from the unaware world outside. Law 6, the spectacle of the leader's presence. The charisma that is not merely personal magnetism, but the specific aura of someone who has constructed their persona with extraordinary care and maintains it with extraordinary energy. The sense that being in the room with this person is different from being in any other room. Law 11. The dependency cultivation. The specific mechanisms by which members become progressively less able to function outside the group, the erosion of outside relationships, the restructuring of finances, living arrangements, social networks to flow through the group. Law 43. The work on hearts and minds, the love bombing of new members, the specific emotional attunement that makes each person feel genuinely seen, genuinely understood, genuinely important in a way that their previous life had not allowed. Law 16. The intermittent reinforcement of the leader's approval, the withdrawal and return of the charismatic center that keeps members in the specific state of anxious longing that makes the group's internal reward structure more powerful than anything outside it. The 48 laws, applied to the specific psychological vulnerability of the person who is seeking meaning and belonging and certainty, produce the cult. Not as an aberration, as the logical endpoint of the power mechanics application to the most fundamental human needs. Understanding this does not inoculate against it completely. The vulnerability that cults exploit is real. The needs they engage, for belonging, for meaning, for certainty, for the sense of being part of something larger than the individual self, are genuine needs, not weaknesses to be eliminated. But understanding the mechanics, seeing how the laws function in the specific high-stakes context of the belief community, makes the specific signatures of the manipulation visible before they have produced the dependency that makes exit so costly. Every political system produces them, not the idealists, the people who entered politics because they believed in something and who remain, sometimes heroically, capable of sacrificing position for principle. The operators, the people whose relationship to their own stated beliefs is entirely functional, who hold whatever positions are necessary at any given moment to maintain the power that was always the actual goal. The operator applies Law 20, never committing, maintaining the flexibility that allows continuous repositioning without the appearance of inconsistency. The politician who was for the policy before they were against it, who was against it before they were for it again, who narrates each repositioning as a principled response to changed circumstances, rather than as the strategic adaptation to changed power dynamics that it actually was. The operator applies Law 38, thinking one way and behaving another. The private cynicism and the public faith. The specific interior monologue of the political professional who has seen enough of the sausage-making to have lost most illusions, and who maintains, for the purposes of the public career, performance of conviction that is sufficiently sincere to be convincing and sufficiently controlled to be modified as circumstances require. The operator applies Law 26, keeping hands clean, the specific organizational seal of ensuring that the decisions with the most difficult moral dimensions are implemented by visible subordinates, while the directing intelligence remains at sufficient remove to maintain deniability. The chain of consequences is traceable by anyone willing to trace it. The convention is that no one traces it, that the subordinate's responsibility is accepted as the terminal accountability, and the person who gave the instructions remains clean. The power without principle produces specific consequences at scale. It produces governance that is organized around the maintenance of power rather than around the purposes for which power is ostensibly sought. It produces a class of professional political operators whose skill set is entirely about power navigation, about the 48 laws, and whose knowledge of policy, governance, and the actual effects of political decisions on actual people is thin and decreasing. And it produces, in the people who are governed by this class, a specific combination of cynicism and resignation, the sense that the official story about democratic representation and accountable governance is a performance, that the actual mechanisms of power are inaccessible to normal citizens, that the laws that govern everyone else do not govern the people with enough power to evade them. This is the political consequence of a world organized by the 48 laws. Not tyranny, not in the dramatic, obviously illegitimate form. Something quieter and in some ways harder to address. Legitimate appearing power organized entirely around its own maintenance, at the expense of the purposes it was supposed to serve, We have arrived at the accounting that the book defers. The 48 laws are effective. This documentary has not disputed that. The historical evidence Greene marshals is real. The psychological mechanisms are real. The outcomes, the accumulation and maintenance of power are achieved where the laws are skillfully applied with a consistency that the alternatives cannot match. What are the costs? First, the cost to intimacy. The person who applies the laws consistently has converted every relationship into a strategic one. The strategic relationship is not without value. It can be warm, mutually beneficial, long-lasting, and functionally indistinguishable from genuine friendship in many of its visible features. But the strategic relationship is not the same as genuine intimacy. Genuine intimacy, the state of being known, fully and without management, by another person who chooses to remain, is not compatible with the consistent application of laws that require the management of every interaction for strategic effect. You cannot be fully known and strategically managed simultaneously. The laws choose management. The cost is the being known. Second, the cost to honesty. The person who applies Law 3 consistently, who conceals intentions, who manages others' perceptions, who maintains the gap between what they show and what they intend, has built a life of sustained inauthenticity. The sustained performance of a self that is not the actual self. This is not comfortable. The performance requires energy. It requires continuous vigilance, the monitoring of what has been shown to whom, the management of consistency across different audiences who must be given different impressions, the specific anxiety of the person who is always managing their own presentation. And it produces, over time, a specific alienation. The alienation of not knowing any longer what you actually think versus what you have decided to appear to think. The alienation of having performed a version of yourself so long that the version and the person have become difficult to distinguish. The alienation of the question, asked in the honest dark moments that the strategic mind cannot entirely prevent, of whether there is anything left underneath the performance. Third, the cost to meaning. This is the one that takes the longest to manifest and is the hardest to acknowledge when it does. Power in itself does not produce meaning. The sense that your existence matters, that you are contributing to something beyond yourself, that the specific, finite, unrepeatable life you are living is pointing at something, this is not a byproduct of power. It is a product of genuine engagement with purposes larger than strategic advantage. The person who has organized their life around the accumulation of power, who has applied the laws consistently and successfully, who has climbed the hierarchy and consolidated the position and managed the threats and maintained the dominance, sometimes arrives, in middle age or late life, at a specific and terrible clarity. The thing they were climbing toward was not what they thought it was. The position achieved does not produce the satisfaction that the pursuit promised. The power over others does not satisfy the specific hunger that made the pursuit feel urgent, and the relationships that the pursuit required them to convert into strategic assets are not available to provide the comfort that might otherwise soften the recognition. The most important question this documentary has not yet directly answered is this. Given everything we have described, what should you actually do with this knowledge? One answer is the aggressive one, the answer that the book's most enthusiastic readers tend to adopt. Learn the laws, apply the laws, navigate the world more effectively by understanding its actual operating mechanics, rather than the official story about its operating mechanics. This is a valid answer, within limits. The person who understands the laws is harder to manipulate than the person who does not. The person who recognizes Law 27 being applied to them, who sees the cult of belief mechanics being activated, is in a position to evaluate the activation rather than simply experiencing its effects. The person who understands Law 33 can notice when someone is probing for their thumbscrew and decline to provide it. The person who understands Law 12 can ask, when receiving an apparently generous gesture of honesty, what the selective disclosure is designed to accomplish. This is the defensive use of the laws, not the application of them for strategic advantage over others, the recognition of them in situations where others are applying them at your expense. The defensive use does not require the moral compromise of the aggressive use. It requires only the attention that comes from understanding. The ability to name what is happening is a form of protection that does not require you to do the same thing to others. It simply requires you to see. The second answer is the more demanding one. Not just read the laws defensively, read them as a mirror. Ask for each law not only where has this been used on me, but where have I used this perhaps without knowing it? The identification of the laws in your own behaviour, the recognition that you have applied Law 1, that you have used Law 2, that you have engaged Law 12's selective honesty, is not comfortable. But it is the beginning of something more honest than either the aggressive or the purely defensive use. It is the beginning of understanding your own relationship to power, the specific ways in which you seek it, maintain it, protect it, and use it. And that understanding, honest, specific, unflinching, is the prerequisite for the question that neither Greene's book nor this documentary can answer for you, but that everything we have traced together has been building toward. What kind of person do you want to be? Not strategically, not in terms of the power you want to accumulate or the position you want to reach, in terms of the relationships you want to be capable of, the kind of presence you want to bring to the people who encounter you, the texture of the life you want to have lived when you are at its end and looking back. These questions are not answered by the 48 laws, they are answered by the thing that the 48 laws consistently ask you to subordinate: the authentic self, with its genuine needs and genuine values and genuine capacity for genuine connection, that exists beneath the strategic persona, and that the strategic persona, however skillfully constructed, cannot permanently replace. History is generous with cautionary examples. Let us visit a few of them honestly. Julius Caesar. Applied law. 6. Courted attention with obsessive dedication. Applied law 25 recreated himself from minor aristocrat to the greatest Roman of his age. Applied law 30 made his extraordinary achievements appear effortless. Applied law 47 and then violated it catastrophically, going past the mark he had aimed for until the mark became the dictatorship that his allies had accepted only as a temporary expedient, and that he showed no sign of intending to end. He was stabbed 23 times on the Ides of March by the men he considered his closest allies. The assassination was organised partly by Brutus, the friend he trusted, and by Cassius, the man whose envy he had underestimated. He violated Law 2 with Brutus, he violated Law 19 with Cassius, he violated Law 47 with the dictatorship, and he paid the price that the laws, violated, consistently extract. He was 55 years old. Niccolo Machiavelli himself, the man who arguably wrote the first version of the 48 Laws in The Prince and the Discourses, applied them imperfectly throughout his career in the Florentine Republic and spent the last decade of his life in obscurity and poverty after the Medicis returned to power and purged the government he had served. The most sophisticated analyst of power in Renaissance Italy could not sustain his own position against the specific political reversal that his analytical framework had documented as inevitable. He died, by most accounts, bitter, having spent his intellectual life understanding power and his practical life unable to navigate it successfully. This gap between the theory and the life is its own kind of lesson. Robert Greene himself suffered a massive stroke at 57, at the height of his power and fame. He has written about the experience with the honesty that characterises his best work. The stroke stripped him of many of the capacities that his identity was organised around. The formlessness that Law 48 advocates was not a strategic choice. It was forced, and in the forcing he found something that the laws, in all their strategic sophistication, had not prepared him for: the encounter with limitation, the specific humbling that comes from the body's power over the mind, the recognition that the laws operate within a frame that no law in the list governs. The frame is mortality. The fact that all of this, the power, the position, the strategic mastery, is temporary. That the self it is all organised around is finite. That the end of the game is not a position from which the laws are dispensed with, but the end of the player. No one applies the 48 laws in the last moment. In the last moment, the only thing that matters is what you did with the time you had. Not the power you accumulated in it. What you did with it, who you were in it, how you treated the people you encountered. These are not strategic questions. They are the only questions that the end makes visible. We have been in the territory of strategy for a long time. It is time to say something directly about ethics. Not because ethics is separate from strategy, not because the moral dimension is an add-on to the strategic analysis, because ethics is the answer to the question that strategy cannot ask. What is power? Every one of the 48 laws answers the question, how do I get more power? None of them addresses the question, what should I do with it? The first question is tactical. The second is the only one that actually matters. Power is the capacity to shape outcomes, your own outcomes, others' outcomes, the outcomes of situations that affect everyone in them. The capacity is neutral. What determines its moral character is what it is used to shape, and how the shaping is done, and who bears the costs of the shaping and who receives the benefits. The person who has accumulated power, who has applied some version of the 48 laws with sufficient skill to reach a position of genuine influence over the lives of other people, is at the moment where the moral question is most pressing. Not before. Before the power is accumulated, the moral questions are mostly theoretical. After, when the capacity to shape outcomes is real, the question of what to do with it has real consequences for real people. And the answer that the 48 laws provide, maintain the power, extend the power, protect the power from all threats, is the answer that consistently produces the historical outcomes we have been documenting. The outcomes that fill the historical record with the names of the powerful and the uncounted mass of the people their power was exercised upon. What would the alternative answer look like? It would look like the recognition that power over others is a temporary custody, not a permanent possession. That the people over whom power is exercised have their own interests, their own intelligence, their own claims on the outcomes that the power shapes. That genuine leadership, the use of power in genuine service of the people subject to it, is both morally superior to the law-based strategic model and, over the long run, more stable. Because genuine service generates genuine loyalty. Genuine loyalty is more durable than manufactured dependency. And the person who has developed the real capabilities and real well-being of the people around them has created something that the 48 laws, applied to maintain dependency, cannot produce. An institution, a relationship, a legacy that is worth maintaining after the power that created it is gone. This is not naivete. The person who serves genuinely still needs to understand the laws, to protect themselves from the people who are applying them without conscience, to navigate the environments where strategic behavior is universal, to recognize manipulation when it is happening to them. Knowledge of mechanics is not optional for anyone who wants to operate effectively in the social world, but knowledge of the mechanics in service of genuine purpose, in service of the actual well-being of the actual people you are responsible for, produces something different from knowledge of the mechanics in service of the mechanics themselves. It produces the exercise of power that history remembers for reasons other than the power. The teacher who developed the genuine capabilities of students who then exceeded them. The leader who built an institution strong enough to survive their departure. The parent who raised children capable of genuine independence. The friend who remained present through the specific difficulty that tested the friendship. None of these are applications of the 48 laws. They are the living refutation of the premise that the laws describe the only game worth playing. There is a paradox at the heart of the 48 laws that the book does not fully confront. The person who applies the laws most consistently is the person most in bondage to power, not because the application fails, it succeeds, but because the success creates a dependency on the success. The person who has accumulated power through the strategic management of every relationship, every interaction, every impression, that person has built a life that requires the continuous, active, exhausting maintenance of the strategic posture. There is no rest from the management. There is no moment off the stage. There is no relationship that can simply be in without being also managed. This is not freedom. It is the most sophisticated form of the prison that the laws were supposedly designed to escape. The person who was powerless, who was subject to others' decisions, at the mercy of forces they could not control, was in one kind of prison, uncomfortable, undignified, sometimes dangerous, but also in some strange way, free of the burden of maintaining the strategic persona, free of the exhaustion of continuous management, free to be whatever they actually were because what they actually were had no power to protect. The person who has achieved power through the laws is in a different prison, one of their own construction, one that they maintain because they have learned through the experience of powerlessness that the alternative is unacceptable, and one that they cannot exit because exiting requires releasing the strategic posture, and releasing the strategic posture requires trusting a world that the entire pursuit of power was organized around not trusting. This is the deepest cost of the 48 laws, not any of the specific costs we have enumerated, the loss of intimacy, the loss of honesty, the progressive isolation of the powerful. The deepest cost is the loss of the specific freedom that exists when you are not performing yourself, when you are simply, without management or strategy, the person you are. The Taoists understood this. The 48th law, assume formlessness, points toward it. The person who is genuinely without form, who has no fixed self to protect, who is not maintaining a strategic persona, that person is free in a way that no accumulation of power over others can produce, because their freedom does not depend on the maintenance of anything. It is simply the natural condition of being present to what is, without the armour of what needs to be managed. This is the paradox. The deepest power, the power over your own experience, the freedom from the need to manage the world in order to feel safe in it, is available precisely through the release of the strategic posture that the 48 laws are designed to maintain. Not because strategy is worthless. In a world where others are strategic, being entirely without strategy is not enlightenment. It is naivete. But knowing when the strategy is in service of genuine living, and when the strategy has become the substitute for it, that is the discernment that the 48 laws cannot provide because it requires standing outside them. The most important effect of understanding the 48 laws is not the ability to apply them. It is the changing consciousness that understanding them produces. The person who has genuinely absorbed this framework, who has traced each mechanism, felt its moral dimensions, recognized its presence in their own behavior and in the behavior of others, is a different observer of social life than the person who has not. Not smarter, more awake to a specific layer of what is happening. The meeting where the agenda is officially collaborative but actually contains the specific dynamics of Law 1 playing out between two people competing for the approval of a third. The relationship where the apparent generosity of one party is actually the investment described in Law 40. The organisation where the culture of apparently open feedback is actually the Law 14 information extraction system, where sharing difficulties is not met with support but with data collection. These things were always there. Understanding the laws makes them visible, and visibility changes the relationship to them, not because visibility eliminates them, but because the person who can name what is happening is not inside it in the same way as the person who cannot. The name manipulation is not the same experience as the unnamed one. The person who can say this is Law 27 being applied to me, who can identify the cult of belief mechanics being activated, who can feel the pull of the manufactured belief without being fully captured by it, is in a qualitatively different position than the person who is simply experiencing a compelling vision without the vocabulary to evaluate it. This is what the education in powers mechanics provides. Not immunity, consciousness. The specific quality of consciousness that can observe the game while being in it. That can feel the pull of the laws while not being entirely governed by them. That can make genuine choices about how to navigate a world organized by these mechanics, rather than being navigated by the mechanics themselves. This consciousness is available to anyone who is willing to look, at the history, at the psychology, at themselves. It does not require cynicism, it requires honesty, the specific, sustained, uncomfortable honesty that this documentary has been asking for throughout. We are at the end of the 48 laws and the end of the framework that explains them. We have traced the mechanisms, documented the costs, noted the history's testimony about where the full application of the laws leads. What comes after the understanding, not innocence? Once you have understood how the machinery works, the innocence that existed before the understanding is not available. You cannot unknow the mechanisms. You cannot unsee the strategic dimensions of interactions that now carry the awareness of those dimensions. You are, in the most precise sense of the word, complicit. You know enough to see what is happening, and what you do with that knowledge is your responsibility, not cynicism either. The cynic's response to understanding the power game is to conclude that the game is all there is, that the strategic dimension is the only dimension, that every human interaction is reducible to power dynamics, that the apparent goods of genuine relationship and honest communication and genuine service are simply more sophisticated versions of the laws being applied at a deeper level. This conclusion is wrong, not naively wrong. There is a version of it that's psychologically sophisticated and historically grounded, but ultimately wrong because it is self-refuting. The person who believes that everything is power, strategy, is a person who can make no genuine choices because their choices are all, in their own framework, just strategy. Their apparent generosity is Law 40. Their apparent honesty is Law 12. Their apparent friendship is Law 14. The framework collapses the category of the genuine entirely, and a framework that eliminates the genuine as a category cannot generate the question of what to do with the knowledge it provides, because the question presupposes a genuine questioner. What comes after the laws is the person who has understood them and remains capable of choosing otherwise. Not always. Not in every situation. The world that the laws describe is real, and the person who navigates it without any understanding of its mechanics is not protecting themselves or anyone else through their naivete. In environments of genuine strategic behavior, some strategic awareness is required for honest functioning. The parent who cannot recognize manipulation cannot protect their child from it. The employee who cannot recognize organizational power dynamics cannot navigate them honestly. But the person who has understood the laws and remains capable of choosing otherwise, who has the strategic awareness and the genuine character that can decide when strategy is necessary and when it is the obstacle, is the most complete kind of person this territory produces. Neither the naif nor the operator, the person who sees clearly and chooses deliberately. That person is the best possible reader of this documentary, not the person who finished it with a plan to apply the laws more effectively, the person who finished it with a more honest understanding of the world, including the parts of the world that are themselves, and a more genuine capacity for the choices that understanding makes possible. Before the final words, honesty requires the acknowledgement of what the 48 laws of power got genuinely right, not just strategically, but philosophically. It got right that power exists, that it is not evenly distributed, that the distribution of power shapes the conditions of everyone's life regardless of whether they have engaged with power's mechanics, that the naive refusal to acknowledge power, the insistence on operating as if the official story about merit and fairness and the level playing field were the complete story, is not virtue. It is a specific kind of blindness that consistently disadvantages the people who maintain it. It got right that understanding is better than ignorance. That the person who knows the mechanics of influence is in a genuinely better position, more capable of genuine choice, more capable of genuine protection of themselves and others than the person who does not. That the knowledge, uncomfortable as it is preferable to the alternatives. It got right that human psychology is specific, predictable, and enormously consequential, that the tendency to reciprocate, to follow social proof, to protect self-consistency, to respond to authority, these are real features of how human minds work, not aberrations to be corrected, and that the environments we inhabit are largely designed to engage these features, usually without our knowledge, and usually in service of interests other than ours. It got right that history is a laboratory, that the specific embodied consequences of specific strategic choices, played out in real courts, real organizations, real relationships, over real time with real costs to real people, contain more practical knowledge about power's mechanics than any abstract analysis can provide, and that the willingness to look at that record honestly, without the comfort of moral categorization that removes the distance between then and now, is one of the most important intellectual disciplines available. These are real contributions. They are the reason the book has mattered to 3 million readers across 25 years and 30 languages. They are the reason this documentary exists. And now the honest accounting of the limitations. The book presents itself as a description of universal laws. The universality is overstated. The laws describe specific dynamics, real dynamics, importantly real dynamics, but they describe them in a context that is not universal. They describe the dynamics of competitive hierarchical environments with differential power distribution. This is a large and important category. It is not all of human social life. The dynamics of deep friendship, the relationship organized around genuine mutual investment, genuine shared history, the willingness to absorb costs for the other without calculating the return, are not well described by the 48 laws. The dynamics of genuine creative collaboration, the specific kind of productive relationship between people who are genuinely working toward a shared goal, rather than competing for position, are not well described. The dynamics of genuine mentorship, genuine parenting, genuine community, all of the specifically human forms of relationship that are organized around genuine care, rather than strategic advantage, these are not well described by a framework that reduces all relationship to power dynamics. This is a genuine limitation. The book is not wrong about what it describes. It is incomplete about what it does not describe. The second limitation is the absence of the moral dimension as a practical consideration rather than an ethical abstraction. The book treats morality as an external constraint on strategic behavior, something that might limit the law's application in specific contexts for practical reasons. It does not treat morality as itself a form of power, as the thing that, when genuine, produces the trust, the loyalty, the genuine cooperation that strategic behavior can only approximate and at enormous cost. The leader whose people genuinely trust them, not because of manufactured dependency, not because of managed information, not because of the strategic cultivation of their emotional needs, but because the leader has consistently acted in their genuine interest, has been honest with them at personal cost, has maintained their welfare when maintaining it was expensive. That leader has power that no application of the 48 laws can produce, because it is not based on any of the mechanisms the laws describe. It is based on something the laws consistently require you to sacrifice in order to accumulate the kind of power they describe. The final limitation is the one most relevant to the moment we are living in. The 48 laws were developed from a historical record that predates the information environment of the present. The mechanisms of reputation management, attention cultivation, social proof manipulation, and the concealment of intentions have been transformed in scale, in speed, in the number of people who can apply them simultaneously, and in the number of people who are subject to them, by the information technologies of the last 3 decades. The laws apply in this environment. They apply with a force and a reach that the courts of Renaissance Italy could not have imagined. And the moral costs of their application, the specific damage done to social epistemology, to political discourse, to the possibility of shared reality in a world where everyone with a smartphone has access to the tools of Law 6 and Law 32 and Law 27, are costs that the book's framework does not address because the book was written before the scale of those costs was visible. We are living in a world where the 48 laws are being applied at civilizational scale by entities, platforms, governments, corporations, political movements, with resources and data and algorithmic precision that no Renaissance prince could have deployed. The question of what to do about this is the most important political question of our era, and the answer begins with the understanding that this documentary has been attempting to provide. Not the application of the laws, the recognition of them. We have arrived at the question that the entire preceding narrative has been building toward, not as a rhetorical question, not as the kind of question that announces its answer in the asking, as a genuine question, the hardest one. Is power worth it? Not power in the abstract, specific power. The power that the 48 laws describe and the history documents. The power accumulated through the consistent application of mechanisms that cost intimacy, cost honesty, cost the specific freedom of the person who is not performing themselves. The power that insulates you from certain threats while creating others. The power that places you at the center of everything and leaves you touched by nothing real. Is it worth the cost? The answer depends on what you're optimizing for. And what you're optimizing for depends on what you believe a life is for. And what you believe a life is for is not a question that strategy can answer. It is not a question that 48 laws can answer. It is the question underneath all the questions, the one that makes the other questions matter or not, and it is, finally and necessarily, yours to answer. History's record is not encouraging about what the full pursuit of power produces for the person who pursues it. The record is consistent. Power accumulates. Relationships deplete. Position rises. Connection diminishes. The achievement arrives. The satisfaction does not. The game is won. The self that was playing it is no longer entirely sure what winning was for, and the people who have found the most durable form of what might be called the good life, the people whose existence, looked at honestly from the outside and from the inside, seems to have been worth what it cost, are, more often than not the people who accumulated the most power over others. They are the people who invested most deeply in what power cannot produce: genuine relationship, genuine contribution, genuine creative work, genuine presence to the specific unrepeatable life they were given. These are not strategic achievements. They cannot be engineered by the laws. They require the specific vulnerability that the laws are designed to eliminate. The willingness to be genuinely seen, to genuinely care, to genuinely invest in outcomes that you cannot control, to be genuinely present in the specific, finite, mortal life that you actually have, rather than the more powerful life that you could accumulate the strategic assets to approach. The 48 laws are real. They work in the domain where they work. And the domain where they work is not the domain where the most important things happen. The most important things happen in the gap that the laws cannot close, the gap between the strategic person and the person they are being strategic for, the gap between power over others and genuine presence with them, the gap between the life that is managed and the life that is lived. You now know the laws, you know how they work, why they work, what they cost, what they produce, who has paid for them, and what the payment purchased. You know the mechanisms. You have seen the machinery. The question that remains, the only question that matters, is not how to use the machinery. It is what to do with the time that you have before the machinery stops. That question is yours. It has always been yours. The 48 laws are one possible answer. They are not the only one. They are not, in the final accounting, the best one. But they are the answer that the world will constantly, pressingly, sometimes urgently offer you. Through every institution you inhabit, every power structure you navigate, every relationship where the strategic dimension is present, which is most of them. Understanding the offer is the beginning of being able to decline it. And declining it, when declining it is the right choice, is the beginning of the specific, difficult, irreplaceable work of living, as though you believe that something more than power is worth pursuing. Whether you believe it is, in the end, up to you. That was always the point.